cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 141. I'm here. A blockade was issued as soon as the war clouds began to roll by. The order was immediately relayed to all civilians. Movement in and out of the city was immediately suspended, hence no one could either enter or escape from the city. Kyle paced in front of the headquarters with a worried look on his face as he wandered about the barracks. It had come so quickly and left them all rattled and unprepared. As such, the plan to send Leyla back to Berg was halted. Everything had suddenly gone wrong in such a short time. Eder, who became a traitor and put the entire Berg Confederacy in trouble, eventually decided to participate in the war and sided with Levita. And Sienna ended up being in the middle of the war zone, seeing as the surrounding regions of both Confederates soon began to pick their sides. Most of the higher-ups feared an imminent recapture of Sienna would soon take place. Kyle's expression after checking the watch on his wrist became more anxious. He could no longer afford to wait for Leyla to recover sufficiently, or even wait for the legal documents to come through to allow them to travel back to Berg. There wasn't any news from command, but the alert that the enemy was just around the corner made things so tense around the barracks. It could be seen plainly by the urgency in each soldier's actions around camp. Gone was the easygoing air around the camp before, now replaced with bated breaths and tense postures as everything could go wrong at a snap of a finger. Sienna had once again become a dangerous battlefield that could be engulfed in gunfire at any moment. Thus the need to get Leyla out of this city right now was becoming more imperative, but how would they break through the blockade? When the hot bloods in command managed to calm down enough, the officers finally left the privacy of the command tent after the high-tension meeting. Kyle found Matthias in a heartbeat. As expected, he acted no differently than usual. They both met each other's eyes from time to time before they would part ways. This time, Kyle needed him. What's happening in the borders? Kyle urgently asked after him, strides matching the major hurriedly. He needed to have hoped they still had some time to leave, but Matthias' gaze only hardened. He needed not to say a word more. Kyle knew they won't be allowed to leave now. Then Leyla. Kyle trailed off with a muttered fretting, but Matthias finally spoke up, interrupting his worries. Leyla will leave Sienna soon. Matthias spoke confidently to him. Kyle frowned in confusion. But aren't civilians forbidden to pass through the blockade as well? His question was ignored. Matthias continued. Kyle Atman, can you drive? What? Kyle frowned, before hesitantly answering, yes, I can. But why are you? Kyle trailed off as he followed the stern gaze Matthias had off at a distance. On the other end of his gaze was a row of rushing ambulances in and out of the camp. This had been going back and forth for a while now since the issuance of the blockade. As far as they knew, critical patients are being transported out of their camps, and towards the military hospital nearby, yet far enough away to be safe from any enemy attacks. Are you seriously thinking? Kyle looked to the Duke incredulously, who only gave him a pointed stare. Silence reigned between them as the two men made a wordless conversation. Whatever the Duke was planning, it was clear that he had already made up his mind. Middle. Leyla closed the luggage bag after checking it one last time. She then put on thick-soled shoes, as well as buttoned a thick winter coat tightly around her frail body. All that was left for her to do was to go out to the meeting place at the time Kyle specified for her. She had finished early with a few hours left before she needed to leave, but her nerves were beginning to become frazzled. Things were progressing much more quickly than she thought they would be, and now she found herself having to escape from Sienna in just a few short hours. She never expected to be this nervous about leaving Sienna. Kyle had informed her that he was put in charge of driving an ambulance to transport a critically ill patient outside of Sienna and towards the rear units where the military hospital was located. He gave her specific instructions that she would need to hide in the ambulance so they can get out of the blocked city. Accompanying them was Marquis Lindman, who had been summoned to return to the rear unit as well. He made no mention of Matthias at all, but Leyla just knew he was the mastermind in this risky escape plan for her. Who else would come up with such a scheme just so she'd be safe after all? She can't be wrong about this. But it seemed the time for her to leave him had finally come as well. Leyla had thought about everything over and over again as she prepared to leave. It was all she found herself being able to do. She's about to leave this city, the man, and the days of oppression by him would soon be nothing but memories for her. To forget everything and start a new beginning with her child. There will be no shadow of a duke anywhere in that future life. That's right. This was the best thing to happen to both him and her. Unable to sit in her thoughts in silence anymore, Leyla rushed to open the curtains a little. The bright pale white light from the moon immediately flooded the room she was in. Marquis Lindman said he would come around to pick her up here while Kyle would busy himself driving the ambulance he was assigned to, towards the specified location. She will go with him to where Kyle would be waiting for them. A simple plan, hardly anything would go wrong if nothing interfered. And least of all, Matthias will not come to even bid her goodbye. Her chest clenches at the thought. He was letting her leave. She knew he was a man of his word, but still. Unbidden, her hand came to rub her swollen belly in yearning. Her child would have to leave behind a good father. She can't help but mourn for the bond they would never have. Middle. This should be a secret that only 3 to 4 people would know. For Matthias' sake, Riet had kept his thoughts to himself, but everyone in on it already knew. Violating the military order given by the commander during the war is a serious crime that cannot be covered or pardoned by any brilliant acts or miracles Matthias was planning to make during the war. He wanted to know why his cousin would go to such great lengths to do something so criminal that it could lead him to be tried in front of a military court. And what he was thinking at the moment he agreed to help him do it. Riet splashed water on his face and wiped it dry after a deep sigh. Across from him, Matthias sat. Both cousins were now seated and staring at the darkness beyond the window with contemplative looks. Gone was the intense look he had when outlining his plan to sneak Leyla through the blockade moments earlier. You can leave. He dismissed as if he had sensed Riet's anxiety. Their eyes met each other, but Riet made no move to leave just yet. Is there nothing else I can do besides this? Riet had to ask. He knew what he had to do. He was just to head to the ambulance and return to the rear units, where he'd been originally assigned to. Now if he were to fetch and bring Leyla along on his way to the ambulance, that wasn't exactly disobeying orders. He's still hitching a ride out of Siena in an ambulance, after all. Just an ambulance with a stowaway. Officers leaving the barracks during a war weren't necessarily out of place. An officer in a hurry to leave in the threat of war during a blockade even more so. Hence, their leaving wouldn't raise any eyebrows or bring any unnecessary attention to them. Not unless they catch wind that Leyla would be coming along with them. Well then, I'll consider this as a debt paid, Riet sighed, but not with you, Duke. Debt? Matthias' eyes narrowed at his cousin's words possessively, and Riet would have scoffed in amusement if he wasn't so relieved to find an ounce of expression in the stoic man. It was a while ago when I joked around Miss Lewellin and caused her an accident. Riet explained, so I'll do this one risky thing for her. As penance for my teasing from before. A beat of silence reigned between them before Matthias spoke up. I guess you'll propose to Claudine soon now that our engagement is broken off officially, right? Riet blinked in surprise. How can you tell? Matthias only smirked at his look of surprise. To be honest, Riet expected Matthias to be a little mean and callous about this, but he seemed so at ease. As if there was nothing to worry about. How long have you known? Riet couldn't help but ask with a resigned sigh. Matthias shrugged. Can't exactly tell you when I knew, Matthias replied. But he'd known for a long time that the two had feelings for each other. The pieces just clicked together one day and shrugged the information away. When Claudine had pieced things together between him and Leyla, well, he couldn't help but laugh at the irony of it all. Had you known about it then? Before you got engaged to Claudine? Yes. And yet you went with it anyway. Riet couldn't help but ask bitterly. I didn't agree on it for the union, Matthias said in a matter-of-factly tone. And Riet sighed once again, losing whatever building ill will he had upon the revelation. Yes, you were very unfortunate and yet successful back then, Riet remarked back dryly at him. For Matthias, marriage was just another means to expand his business. Claudine was no different from entering a school worthy of the family's honor and succeeding in the family business. They would have been perfect for each other, Riet thought mirthlessly, if only they got along and saw where the other came from instead of being blinded by their lust and greed. Riet might have grown with him, but there's much he's yet to know about his cousin, but he's only ever certain about him with one thing, and one thing alone. No matter how long a time would pass. Matthias von Herhardt loved Leyla Lewellin, and he let her go because of it. I changed my mind. I will never be sorry for you, Riet declared to him with a stiff smile, and the Duke just shrugged nonchalantly. Do as you wish. Matthias once again marked the end of the meaningless conversation by checking the time. A faint compassion passed by Riet's eyes, who was looking at him as if he was a little tired of it. I'd rather. Before he could even finish, a heavy sound disrupted the silence throughout the deep dawn in the whole barracks. Matthias immediately shot to his feet, then ran to the window and flung open the curtains in alarm. Another heavy boom, and this time, the building rattled around them. It was getting closer, whatever it was that brought the sound. Air raid. Enemy air raid is in place. Distant screams accompanied soon after as another boom, further away, and then another at a different direction came. Sound the alarms. Take shelter. With an alarm sound, a shout rang out to announce the evacuation. The once quiet hotel was a mess in an instant. The time for the ambulance driven by Kailetman to leave Siena was still an hour away. They needed to move up the schedule, immediately. Damn it. Matthias. Riet called out as they held onto the furniture when another boom shook the building. Go to Etman, Matthias cried out in urgency as he held still to avoid being toppled by the nearing blasts. Tell him to get to the rendezvous point immediately and she'll be there as soon as possible. Another boom, and this time, the screams were closer. As soon as she's in, he's to book it out of here immediately. What about you? I don't think I'll get to her in time if I'm to relay this message to him now. Without an answer, Matthias turned around immediately as he left the room, even as the building shook around them. Time was of the essence, he mustn't wait any longer. Hey Matthias! Riet's cries were soon buried in binge drinking and alarm sounds. Matthias ran without looking back. Still in deep darkness, into the streets, and hellfire shells rained upon the captured city. Middle. The roar, which she has never gotten used to, was still too loud even as she clamped both hands over her ears in fright. As soon as the first bomb dropped, Leyla threw away the bag she was clutching before she crawled under a small table in the bedroom and curled up. Basement. I have to go to the basement. Her vision flashes back and forth from the neat room she was in, to the overcrowded basement she hid in before. The basement was in a town square. Where was Uncle Bill? She needed to move. Was she in the streets? Her shoes were left behind, and her feet turned her socks bloody, didn't they? Basement. She needed to get to the basement. Another boom and Leyla cried out for her Uncle Bill. She was having flashbacks. She needed to move. She knew she was still safe, but not for long if she won't move. But her body was frozen in a hunch as she stayed crawled beneath the table, wailing for her dead uncle to come to get her. The next explosion had come too close, and all of a sudden glass erupted around her and Leyla screamed. Gone were the rubbled streets, and in front of her lay the bandaged and beaten down body of Uncle Bill. The doctor's voice filled her head telling her he was dying, and her distant screams for them to help echoed all around her in deafening madness. The fire was across the street. The beautiful home across from the house she'd taken shelter in was turning to ashes. Leyla could only rock back and forth as she tried to lull the unborn child in her belly to soothe up. Shh, we're gonna be okay, we're gonna be okay. We're gonna be okay, she kept saying like a mantra as her eyes stared widely in a hypnotized daze at the fire and debris in front of her. Her head was bobbing up and down as she couldn't look away. She could only hug her knees closer, as much as she could. Her heart was beating erratically, and the smoke and soot started wafting through the broken windows. Soon, she would suffocate, and her baby would suffocate in her womb. More bombs rained from the sky, and she kept flinching even as her eyes remained unblinking. Bony fingers hugged and gripped her arms as she wound them around herself. Nails digging into her skin soon dug too deep as she began to draw blood. Calm. She needed to be calm. She has to be calm. Although her whole body began to tremble, Leyla tried not to let go of her reason somehow. Tick. Tock. Tick. Tock. The still functioning clock was now echoing loudly in her eardrums. Her chest tightened as the air around her began to thin out. She can't breathe. She needed to breathe. How long had the bomb rain been? Was it over? Did it just begin? Was anyone coming to save her? Where was Kyle? Marquis Lindman? Did she have to leave? She can't go alone. She doesn't want to be alone. What if they left her alone? The building shook again, matching the tumultuous thoughts she had in her mind before it returned to him. Matthias von Herhardt. He would come. He always came for her. He'd save her. He was always there for her, whether she wanted to or not. He was just like the birds. Always everywhere, anytime. Surely, he would come. After all, he came here for her once. If anyone would be with her, it would always be him. He would cross an entire battlefield for her. Hi, Leyla. The voice that rose from the heavy ringing in her ears. The moment that gave despair and fear, but more unbearable, was a shadowy feeling that could not and should not exist behind it. Her feelings toward him were like both sides of the coin. From the moment she first saw him until now, it was always like that. A scary and beautiful boy aimed a flash of a gun at her and stepped on her gold coins. The person who made her heart a little more shabby every moment, when she kept looking back even though she didn't want to see him again. Holding back tears, Leyla crawled out of the table and hugged the bag. She knew where the location was. However, the question was whether they could get there safely to avoid this bombing. Don't cry. Leyla comforted herself and forced herself out of the shell she made herself become. She walked out staggering, holding onto the walls and furniture she could grasp as the ground continued to shake sporadically beneath her. However, her vision was getting blurred. The night when she cried after biting a piece of candy that he gave her began to rise beyond her tears. It was her first time tasting such a delicious treat. Why did she have to leave him in the first place? She had a place where she could cry as much as she wanted to back then. Sure, he made her do terrible things against her will, but at least his arms were cozy when they wrapped around her. She never should have left him. The hand that hugged and comforted her a little clumsily was warm. It was ridiculous. Such a shame added to her tears. For such a long time he held her in his arms and stayed still. She could clearly remember the texture of the sweater on her cheek and the taste of the candy that melted away on her tongue. When Leyla, who barely stopped crying, raised her head, she reached out and wiped her wet face. Slowly and gently until she stopped crying. Leyla looked at him blankly. The child inside her, who cried sadly while biting the last candy she had saved, felt like she had stopped crying for a long time. The taste of the candy that was no longer fishy was sweet. The Duke smiled faintly at the moment she realized it. It was very strange. No one in the world likes crying orphans. So Leyla Lewellin has been laughing and laughing. Now she can smile more brightly than anyone else. As if denying an unfamiliar feeling, she hurriedly looked away from him. And he stepped down without being as intimidated as before. The whole time, whenever she left the annex, it was as if she were running away. Back then Leyla thought it strange. Because she was running away from the Duke. As the shadows of the dense trees grew, the deeper she entered the forest path that had even covered the moonlight, she turned around without realizing it, going back to take shelter in his arms. It was a night when the road back to the cabin felt very long. And on that dark road, Leyla looked back and forth over and over again. Every time, she felt like her shadow was growing little by little. She's so embarrassed about that. She hated it. After cutting off such a long shadow. Still, the shadows continued to grow and continued to overwhelm her and the path she walked on. Maybe she was still walking on the road with a long shadow? Maybe this all was just a terrible dream? She'd wake up in his arms soon. Yes, she'd wake up in safety soon. Leyla reached for the door of the bedroom with her squeezed tightly shut as she reached out for the escape. However, even before she opened the door, a clearer and louder voice broke through the muddled ringing in her ears. Leyla. Despite the terrible noises around her, Leyla would recognize that voice anywhere. Matthias, it was him. He did come for her. He was here with her in the flesh, and she couldn't help but be filled with unexpected hope. "Here. I'm here!" Leyla screamed with all her might. "I'm here!" The door burst open not a moment later. Once again her vision blurred, but with relief instead of terror, as she cried at the sight of the new arrival in front of her. She'd recognize him anywhere, even if her vision was obscured. Matthias had come for her. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 142, Promise. They did not have much time to just stand and take in the sight of each other. In no time, Matthias began to hold on to Leyla as soon as she began to fall. Without waiting for her expected protests, he carried her limp form in his arms and ran towards the house's cellar. He had just about enough time to open the basement door and jump down the ladder before the ground above them shook and dust began falling from the ceiling. The bomb was much closer than before. Not bothering to find the light in the dark cellar, he immediately put Leyla down, who backed up from the door and leaned her back against the cellar's wall. She was dazed, breathing heavily as her body shook with the continued rain from outside. Immediately he gathered her securely in his arms and drew her away from the shelves where many stored foods were placed in case they fell on her. He caressed the back of her head soothingly, making her rest against the crook in his neck. "It's all right," he murmured soothingly against her temples, breaking the monotone sounds of muffled bombs over their heads. After a while, he felt her begin to pull away, just enough to look up at him. He cupped her cheeks, and caressed her wet and flushed skin with the pads of his calloused thumb. "You'll be fine soon," he whispered, resolute and softer. Even in the dark, she could feel his intense gaze on her. She could see just how deep his eyes reflected his soul, like an ocean inviting her into its depths. A depth that often made her scared, hate, and the less acknowledged excitement at the sight of it, especially as he embraced her securely. Matthias was certain there could be a lamp somewhere to shed some light, but he couldn't afford to find it. And so, in the thick darkness surrounding them, they endured the long night, relying on each other's body temperature to keep warm, and their cinched breathing for comfort. The longer they stayed down in the basement, the more Leyla's eyes gradually got used to the darkness. Without thinking about it, Leyla reached out for a change and cupped Matthias' face. She still couldn't see clearly, yet she could finally make out some of his features. He looked positively unprepared and haggard in front of her. With her other hand resting against his chest, she could feel his abnormal warmth and sweat rolling down his body, his breathing ragged, and the heartbeat beneath her palms erratic and strong. He came running just for her. There was a sense of glee upon the realization he braved through fields of dropping bombs, just for her. It made her feel safer, made her breathe a lot easier than earlier when no one came for her. The relief, sadness, and indescribable emotions began pouring out of her into silent, crocodile tears. It was ridiculous how easily she could tell Matthias apart even amidst her blurring visions. Ridiculous how she waited unknowingly in the middle of an airstrike for him to come to rescue her and cradle her in his arms. She had told herself time and again that he would never take her back. And like a fool, she waited for him to come and get her anyway. She gripped Matthias' arm tightly, a wordless plea to keep him connected to her when she felt him begin to pull away from her. "Hold on, Leyla." Matthias grunted after a momentary pause. "It's dangerous right now," he told her seriously before looking off at a distance, through the only small window in the cellar to catch sight of explosions and rubble in the grounds above. "I'll take you to Edmund as soon as the bombing stops," he promised her, gripping her closer to him in tandem. She felt her heart break at his words, as her lips trembled at the implication. He was rejecting her when she wanted nothing more than to stay with him. She immediately began to protest against his wishes with a shake of her head, but Matthias was no longer paying attention to her. He wasn't looking at her anymore. She wanted to ask what he was seeing, and whether or not he was fine, but the words remained stuck in her throat. Instead, she made do with looking at his side profile instead as he surveyed their surroundings, not even sparing her a single glance. Memories flowed along with Matthias' heartbeat, which deafened her to the sound of the world collapsing around them. A man who brutally harassed and hurt her. The person she declared to hate the most in the world. The cruel man ruined her life without any remorse. That's why she shouldn't forgive him. Why, she'll have to live without seeing him ever again. It was a natural thing to do after the abuse he put her through. What she should be doing. But he was also a man who couldn't be truly cruel to the very end despite his harsh actions towards her. How could she have ever thought to resist him? Even with their lives threatened to be over now, she couldn't help but look and savor this image of his sweet eyes and warm touch. Her mind fought back with those heartless and affectionate moments they had in the past, dangled in sheets and limbs wrapped around each other. She wanted to turn a blind eye to it, but it didn't work out. It always had been like this. She'd always been in love. Even if she thought it couldn't be, her heart kept yearning for him to love her. Even if it had gone twisted and distorted, clumsy, or even if she tried to deny it with every fiber of her being, she still loved him with everything she had. She always belonged to him. Both her mind and heart had already been his. All their moments together could have been a fairy tale if she'd been honest in the beginning. And now she's the one begging him to look at her. Look at me. Her mind screamed at him, but no words came out of her mouth. Instead, she reached out and cupped his cheek to direct his gaze back to her. When he finally glanced down at her, he gave her a look of confusion. She looked at him only in a dazed manner, trying to convey her confession. But after a few seconds, he turned away from her once again. Even though he wrapped her tightly in his arms, he refused to see her. As soon as he turned away from her, it finally dawned on Leyla. She's always been the one looking at him from afar. Always been yearning to be part of his world. And that the time she spent crying out because of him was not just because of pain and shame. Shaking the bittersweet memories out of her mind, she reached out once more, urging him again to look only at her. Gently yet firmly turning Matthias by the cheek once more. A mirror of his actions to her from before. Look at me, Leyla. Matthias pointedly stared at her. Baby, she murmured, finally finding her voice once more. The sound of shell explosions was still echoing on the ground. Name my baby. She pleaded for him, caressing his cheeks like she once did when she laid naked beside him back in Arvis. Her hands began to tremble as he continued to stare at her in silence, so she pressed on. I'll wait for you, she told him in a whisper, hot breath reaching up to touch his lips. I'm going to wait for you with my baby, so give it a name. Please. She begged him, blinking up prettily at him in the way she knew he could never resist. She would never have been able to start anew. She just wanted to be with Matthias. It may be a stupid choice. This might not be normal love even, or a healthy one. But she didn't care anymore. This felt too good, to be in his arms like this, to be the wrong kind of love. She doesn't believe this love is wrong. She loved this man. She will only ever wish for this man to be by her side. It's all right now. We'll be fine. She told him with a watery smile, tears still pouring out of her in a pleading way even as she wet her lips. The baby already loves you. She cooed at him lovingly. Since I love you, the baby surely will too. Leyla, I love you. She finally said, smiling so widely and brightly at him. So out of place from the war and air raid happening outside, even as dust continued to rain down on them, blinding her momentarily as she fought to keep her gaze locked on his. She denied herself of this for so long. She can't bring herself to stop now. She doesn't want to stop. Ever. I love you. You are so terrible to me, and I hate you for it, but I love you anyway. She confessed desperately to him, clinging to his neck. I love you, she cried out in a whisper, begging for him to believe her now. Because she does. She always will. No matter what hell he put her through, she'd always choose him. Something shook deep within Matthias' core the longer he stared at her pleading form. She loved him? Does she truly love him? I swear if this is another one of your lies again, Leyla, then I will kill you. He growled at her, but she only smiled brightly at him. I'm gonna kill you, and then myself afterward because I won't ever be parting from you again. No, I'm not lying. She grinned widely at him, with a quick shake of her head to dissuade any disbelief he had of her. I never lied before either, she giggled at him. From the moment I tried to fool you, I already meant everything I told you. Matthias continued to stare at her in disbelief, but she continued. This time, she'd tell him how she felt all this time. I hated how much I enjoyed everything we did. But I loved all of it. I've always loved it. Always love you. One day, she'd give her heart wholly to this man when the war is over. She hated him. She was afraid of him. She despised him. She was hurt because of him. She was sad because of him. She wanted to erase him. She wanted to escape from him. Sometimes she wanted to die because of him. But in the end, then Leyla, you can't escape me forever. He grinned back at her, showing her his perfect, pearly whites, and she couldn't help but giggle up at him now that he believed her. His frown turned upside down into a wide, pure, genuine joy. Now that he promised he wouldn't ever let her go again. She could see now. Her mind and heart didn't need to be mended back together, because everything was fine now. This was it. This was the love she always wanted. The love of this man. Maybe she already knew. In the afternoon, when the sea of Sienna was beautifully shining, the moment she saw him coming to her after passing through the hellish world. "Don't let me go again," she told him, and brought their foreheads together, then their noses, before finally bringing their lips together. She was back home now. With him, engulfed around her senses, she was forever safe. They both pulled away, leaving the tips of their noses together as they exchanged sweet smiles. The crumbling world above them didn't matter anymore. "I'll be waiting for you to come back, and then I'll forgive you for everything if you come back alive," she told him sternly with a pout. "I won't hate you anymore if you do that. And then, we can start all over again," she finished with an excited grin. The prospect of their future together. She can't wait for the time to come. Belatedly she could tell there was a fast-beating heart in the cellar. Whether it was his, hers, or both, it didn't matter. Their hearts now beat together, and that was all that mattered to her. "Towards that time, without hate or sadness, we just have to start over with only our love," she whispered against his lips, and he gripped her tighter in agreement. "You can do it. I can do it, so I'm confident." "The baby agrees," she giggled and began to cry once more. But instead of longing tears, they were now tears of happiness. Because who else would she love if not him? Who else would she have a family with if not with him? There had never been anyone else but him. Another explosion came nearby, but Leyla found herself no longer scared. She was with him. There was no reason to be afraid anymore. Their foreheads rested against each other once more as he breathed a sigh of relief. The tension in his body seeped out of his body the more Leyla nestled against him comfortably. This was all he ever wanted. For her to love him back truly. Unable to help himself, he brought her up to kiss her passionately on the lips. Now accepting of her feelings, Leyla eagerly participated and moaned against his lips. This was heaven, she thought with a sigh. Their hands wound around each other's bodies, roaming and clutching everywhere they could, clinging to each other as if their worlds would end if they don't cement this moment now. "Promise me," she breathed out, as soon as they parted for breath, and looked up at him fiercely in demand. "Promise me that you will come back to us as quickly as you can." "Anything for you," Matthias murmured to her and planted a kiss on the back of her eyelids as her eyes fluttered close. A bright and beautiful smile spread over her kiss-bitten lips. "I'll come back to you. Promise me, and I'll trust you. I believe in you forever no matter what anyone says. You are a man of your word, are you not?" she demanded of him, and he chuckled with amusement at her. "I promise, Leyla." He breathed out with a wide grin of his own and brought her lips back to his, as he hugged her impossibly closer to him. She cried and moaned and sighed against him all night, but he was now complete. For the distrust and hate and disgust in her eyes were now filled with open longing and love and acceptance, just for him to see. For him to take. And it was all he ever wanted in the beginning. "I'll come back to you," he breathed out. "I promise. Middle. 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 The bombing stopped at the crack of dawn. And as soon as the coast was clear, Matthias wasted no time in leading Leyla through the rubble, hugging her close to him by the waist. They were long past their due time, and he was certain that no matter how long Kyle and Riet would stall for more in time for their arrival, any more than now would cause suspicion to arise. The dawn revealed only rubble and smoke in its wake the more the sun rose, but Matthias could not afford for them to stop. Leyla must still leave this city now, before more attacks come. It was the only thought pushing him past his limits, even as Leyla was visibly getting more tired from the traveling. Kyle decided to wait in front of the north gate of the walls surrounding the city. Originally, it was a deserted place, but now that all troops are gathering due to the enemy's surprise attack, the vicinity has been turned into nothing but a ghost town. The blue clear dawn light shone on the world, where the debris from wall buildings and shrapnels from the bombs were slowly revealed to everyone who survived the night. The sound of waves flooded his ears. Before Matthias' rough breathing was all he could take note of. "Matthias! Come on! We have to hurry," Riet shouted to a whisper as soon as he caught sight of them. Matthias need only look at the ones to see they just arrived in the nick of time before someone would come to question why they haven't gone yet. Without stopping for any pleasantries, Matthias immediately rushed to the front of the ambulance, just as Riet swung open the door to receive Layla's pregnant form. But Matthias did not let her go, just gently deposited her immediately in a comfortable position, and wrapped a snug wrap around her shoulders as he sat her next to Kyle. "Leah." He spoke up immediately as soon as he was done securing her. He squeezed her hand, and brought it up to his lips as he stared into her wide, happy eyes as she smiled at him. He finally answered her. She squeezed his hand back tightly, one last reminder of his promise to her. "To both of them." "And if it's a boy?" she asked him with a grin. He merely raised a brow at her, as though he didn't think it could be anything else but a girl. "Felix," he answered plainly after a few beats of silence. Riet's eyes widened in surprise at the change of air between the two. Even more so when he realized where the name had come from. Duke Felix von Herhardt was Matthias' grandfather. The glorious name of a Herhardt man, who was named as the next successor, and thus led to the creation of the prosperity of the family, which in turn was serving them well for the rapidly changing era. Does Leyla know what it means to pass on the name? Riet looked at Leyla, with that thought. But she only beamed in satisfaction at him, like a good little child who was receiving her well-earned reward. There were tears now flowing down her cheeks, and he noted how reluctant she was to let go, but she eventually dropped Matthias' hand from hers. This is how the man who proposed to give the woman everything and the woman who accepted the proposal would part ways. Now, it was the woman's turn to lead and the man to be left behind. Damn it! Riet swallowed a hot breath, spitting out a curse under his breath without realizing it. However, they were out of time for any more sentiments to occur between the couple. As soon as Matthias stepped back from the ambulance, Riet hurried back to the passenger seat, caging Leyla in securely. With both men beside her, she would now be easy to miss. Without waiting for more instructions, the ambulance began to move away. Matthias watched them leave, without a glance back to the ruined city behind him. He was just about to return back to the barracks, when suddenly, the ambulance came to a stop. Not a second later, the passenger door flew open, and Leyla came spilling out into a stumble and began running back to him. He rushed to her immediately, and gathered her into his arms just before she would stumble to the ground. "Leyla!" he breathed out in surprise, confused as to what she had yet to do. She was only breathing heavily, looking at him wide-eyed and crying. Shaky hands began to untie her braid, and clutched her ribbon. Wordlessly, Matthias held out his wrist in understanding, watching as she took her time to wrap it securely around his wrist. He watched her do the same to the birds back in Arvis. And now she was doing the same to him. That was all. Leyla couldn't bring herself to say anything. She believed, if she opened her mouth, she'd only say more inconsequential things. Matthias, who alternately looked at Layla's face with a white ribbon tied to his wrist, smiled and nodded to her in understanding. It was the same smile with a little playfulness and pride, where he had many moments of holding his breath and looking at it without realizing it. The alarm to announce the gathering of the army began to ring again, shaking them out of their reverie, and imposing the urgency they forgot they had. Layla's lips began to tremble, unwilling to leave him. Still, he stroked her rosy cheeks, which did not cry, and nodded once again. "Go, Leyla." Smiling as he swept over her hair tangled in the wind, Matthias lowered his head deeply and kissed Layla's cheek, which was stained with tear marks. "I love you," he whispered against her ear, even as the siren of their army threatened to deafen them with its loudness. That was the last one. Leyla had to stop, turning toward Kyle and Riet, who urgently called her name, telling her there was no time left to waste anymore. Matthias also turned toward the square where the siren rang. Layla's sob, which began the moment she turned away from him, soon came pouring out of her relentlessly. While crying like a child, Leyla walked without stopping or looking back. She didn't want Matthias' steps to be heavy. She thought he would come back lightly if he left lightly. Like the birds of Arvis that she loved, who returned without fail if she waited. The ruined city showed its terrible appearance in the clear morning sun. Before turning the corner of the wall, Matthias turned his head and looked at Leyla. The loose blonde fluttered like a wing behind her running back. Matthias captured the beautiful golden waves in the grey ruins. And then again, he started walking towards the world that was going to be a battlefield. The Confederate Army, in which Eder's troops fought, landed that morning through the Northern Union's blockade. It was the day when the largest battle began since the war, when the autumn sky of Siena was dazzlingly clear. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 143, Time of the Wind. The downtown streets of Rats turned hectic as more than the usual amount of delivery boys for the local paper ran through to toss out the morning papers. In a nearby cafe, seated by the window, Claudine gazed through the glass in quiet observation. The air in the once bustling capital had turned sour and somber as soon as the war came, and their men left them behind. There were mostly children and women around. A common sight she'd finally gotten used to. It didn't help that the recent news from the war front brought them no comfort at all. Burke's army, which had largely dominated the war, had its fortune turned in the latest skirmish. Now, they are struggling against Eder since they have recaptured the city of Siena. And now they're gradually being pushed further north, where not too long ago, the Union's latest attacks had largely been successful. Tensions continue to rise between the two nations, and soon no good news will reach them if it keeps up. Even the fast-approaching New Year's was not enough to lift the spirits of the families the men left behind, especially when it wasn't certain they'd be returning home in glory and victory. The Empire had failed to keep its promise to its people. Don't worry too much, Lady Brandt. Duke Herhardt will certainly return safe and sound. Piped up one of the ladies she was with within the cafe. Of course. No matter how fierce the battle takes place, the Duke will surely return safely. Immediately added another one of Claudine's friends after seeing her contemplative look, mistaking it for worry and longing for her fiancé. That's right. Claudine thought belatedly. To the rest of society, Scherntal was still engaged with Duke Herhardt. A minute, and mirthless smile curled up on the corner of her lips, unseen by those she was with. Officially, they were still engaged, and therefore Claudine von Brandt had every right to worry about the safety of Matthias von Herhardt, as is expected of his woman. Even though deep inside, she was more than hoping he would meet his demise instead in this war and never return again. Perhaps a little earlier, when she had still been less bitter and more amenable to his presence, she would have wished otherwise. But not anymore. It only became increasingly clear how less likely he would return as her soon-to-be wedded husband. Still, she had an image to uphold, and a pretense to act, loath as she is to act as though she cared about the Duke. She often wondered what news would arrive next. A question she asked habitually to herself whenever a new one would arrive in the form of Riet's letter updates to her. He was still in the war front, and she hadn't heard anything of him aside from the ones he sent her, but he was always more than generous in relaying to her the events that he was witnessing. Even when she didn't ask it of him, he still gave her more than she knew she deserved. Even Matthias was less generous than this, even when they were properly engaged. And through Riet's letters, she had learned about Layla's whereabouts and current condition. That Matthias had indeed, and eagerly took part in the war because that was where she would be found. And found her indeed. The big bad Duke had finally been reunited with his lowly orphan girl. The anger she expected to come had long since dried up. Not even news of Layla's pregnancy ignited a single spark of anger in her anymore. Officially they might still be engaged. But Claudine was no longer in the running to be the next Duchess. She'd never been in it. Belatedly she wondered why Matthias even agreed to wed her when he had no intention in following through in the end. This engagement had long been over. Claudine now accepted the fact that she desperately denied, even though she knew it would happen eventually. Truthfully, she would have been fine with their engagement being broken off if only it didn't lead to Matthias' happiness. Why was it, after everything he'd done, he got to have his own happy ending? She didn't want them to be happy. She wanted them to remain miserable as they should be. They were the disgraceful ones, the ones who cheated, and couldn't stay away from each other even when they both promised themselves to another. They shouldn't have a happy ending, when they were the only ones in the wrong. They should both just stay back in Siena and die in the war. It was the only thought that consumed her in the long nights. A loathing wish for Matthias, and his lowly orphan girl, to die and perish. Never to be with each other for all eternity. Eventually, even if their engagement would be broken off officially, Claudine was still able to make a fresh start. Keep her reputation intact, and get engaged anew to a more suitable candidate. While not a widely acceptable tradition to do so, marrying her deceased fiancé's cousin, it wasn't too bad of a reputation that she couldn't just brush off. She resolved to pen him her reply soon. Even though in the present, Claudine was actively taking part in her friends' and ladies' conversations, her mind was stuck back in her room, with the latest letter Riet had sent her. More specifically, his penned confession. In it, she realized that despite his parting words to her that he'd let her go, he still held on to his feelings for her strongly. She thought she'd lost him forever, and she allowed herself a momentary relief at the knowledge he still loved her. But she couldn't bring herself to write back to him so quickly. They lost too much time, trying to do what they thought would be better for themselves before. This time, she wanted to convey her returned feelings for him perfectly. It's the least she could do, for whose heart she broke so selfishly for. Because she wanted this marriage to work. For this engagement to go beyond just a mindless agreement. An engagement where her mind and heart were both in agreement. A union that was both formed out of love and honor for a change. A far cry of the faux engagement she had with the Duke for years. And should Matthias cry, perhaps she will shed some tears, but only out of joy, instead of sorrow. Soon, the time came for them to leave, and one by one, the ladies around her began to go home. The time for social gathering and afternoon dallying with one another had remained to only be mere formality. Their day-to-day gatherings were only ever meant to be for show after all. They found no need to keep up with the pretenses, not with the influx of news about their lost sons, husbands, and brothers to war. A cold and gloomy winter soon rolled by, making the endless funerals day in and day out an even more somber occasion. The only genuine gathering left in Rats was when they'd go out and send their condolences. Which was really why she's even out here in the cafe in the first place. Waiting for her by the main street was her vehicle. She got in, and the chauffeur immediately closed the door behind her before they began to drive back home. Just when the car turned around the corner of the boulevard between the Museum of Natural History and the Museum of Art, Claudine was immediately shaken out of her immersive thoughts at the woman she'd just seen around a corner of her eyes that passed outside her window. It was a blonde woman, wearing thick-rimmed glasses and bundled up warmly, plainly walking down the street. She was already quite a distance away from her now, with her back turned, but the figure eerily seemed familiar to her anyway. "Miss, what's the matter?" The maid, who was looking around, asked her when she noticed the look of alarm in her mistress' face. Claudine, who looked like a cross between suspicion and contemplation, immediately shook her head before she leaned back against the car's seat. "Nothing," she quietly replies, mind running a mile a minute. "Is it Leyla?" The last news she heard from Riet's letter was that Matthias found Leyla, who ran away, pregnant with the Duke's child, and he'd caught her. "But did he send her here? That guy?" "It's nothing," she reiterated when the maid still looked unconvinced that nothing was wrong. Either way, Claudine didn't want to take any part in their affairs anymore. She'd learned that only getting involved with them brought on more shame than satisfaction. She'd settle only with thoughts and wishes that they'd both have their happy ending tarnished by the war. Today was just a normal day. And when nightfall came that night, a new, An hopeful wish overtook her normal thoughts. Instead of wishing for Matthias to die, she wished desperately to receive more news from Riet. And this time, she will give him the answer he deserved from her. She'd keep it short and succinct, so he can get it quickly. And as if her prayers were finally heard, the maid who brought her mail suddenly burst through her bedroom, with a wide, open smile, in her hands an envelope, scrawled with her name by a familiar penmanship. "My lady. Marquis Lindman's letter has arrived," she announced gleefully. Claudine, who had been leaning against the bed and drinking morning tea, shot up to her feet like an excited girl. Barefoot and running, the letter was snatched out of the maid's hands with an excited squeal. The maid's eyes crinkled knowingly at her with a smile as she met her mistress' eyes. Claudine blushed a little and began to look for her slippers and wore them. While the maid turned a blind eye to her mistress' momentary lapse in proper decorum, the door swung open once more without warning. It was the Countess Brandt. "My dear Claudine, what are you going to do?" immediately wailed her mother as she strode into her daughter's room. It surprised Claudine because her mother was the image of proper etiquette and manners. She would have beaten Claudine's hands with a stick for bursting unannounced into another's bedroom. Before she could even ask what was wrong, Claudine found her arms filled with her sobbing mother, and caught sight of this morning's newspaper haphazardly tossed on the table. Great trepidation began to fill her. Middle. When it was time for a boy to read the newspaper to come, her heart jumped. It happened on its own without checking the time. Today, Leyla wandered in front of the house with an anxious face. Soon after, the big eyes of the newspaper delivery boy looking over the street shook nervously. On that clear autumn day, the ambulance that hid Leyla escaped the blockaded Siena safely. She parted ways with Marquis Lindman as soon as they arrived in the rear supply unit, and also bid goodbye to Kyle at a military hospital across the border between Levada and Berg. Once Leyla found herself bereft of companions, she ended up relying on a piece of paper with an unfamiliar address. Before she got on the train headed back to Rats. It was reminiscent of when she came to Arvis on her own. Traveling alone, just like she did as a child. The sadness filled up to the end of her neck was overflowing, but Leyla did not cry. She wasn't alone because she had a child now in her belly. And there was Matthias too. A giddy feeling filled her up as she remembered their kisses. Soon, they'd be reunited once more. So Leyla had to recover her health, give birth to the child, and wait for him with the child. It was as easy as that. And while she waited for his return, she could do whatever she wanted in the meantime. Every day, she waited eagerly for him to return, and made sure to take care of herself without any worry at all. She had nothing more to worry about after all. Matthias was returning to her. And with that in mind, Leyla was able to endure day after day on her own. In her quaint new house. The time for the season to change would soon come, and the child kept growing in her womb. In no time, she'd be giving birth, and finally hold their child in her arms. Oh, how she wished he'd be back in time to be with her during that time too. She was as desperate as she was excited for his return. But despite her newfound freedom and luxury, she was still a little scared. If anything happened to her during childbirth, what would happen to her child if Matthias hadn't returned yet? Of course, Matthias made sure there were butlers and the Duke's lawyers at her beck and call while she recovered and lived in this house, but they were not partners with whom she could rely on her heart. "It's okay. Everything will be fine." As Matthias had done to her, Leyla whispered to the child in the stomach. It was then that light and fast footsteps began to be heard. A boy delivering newspapers was running from across the cold street. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 144, Perfectly Brilliant Light. "How are you doing, Claudine?" asked Countess Brandt in a hesitant voice, her red-rimmed eyes looking at her carefully. The maid who'd been serving them immediately dropped her gaze to the floor, recognizing this moment to be a private affair between her mistresses. This time between them was a tenuous moment. "It's..." Claudine began to speak up softly, before trailing off, a faraway look in her eyes. "It's a difficult time, but I have to endure it well." she diplomatically answered, nodding tersely as though she was trying to convince herself to do so. That's right. We should all do that. Her mother interjected, also preoccupied with her thoughts and feelings to notice just how broken their daughter had turned out to be in the latest news that befell them. The war might as well have dropped a bomb on their house. Well then, make sure you are eating. Her mother added, patting her on the hand absent-mindedly. Think of what he would want for you, she commanded offhandedly, before breaking down into more sobs. Recognizing the order for what it was, the maid hastily excused herself to prepare them a meal, despite the knowledge that Lady Claudine wouldn't touch a single food that would be prepared. Still, she needed to make sure her lady would have something to eat to keep her strength up for these difficult times. After hastily preparing easy-to-eat foods, she immediately went back up to her lady's room, and softly knocked on the closed door. "My lady, I have brought you something to eat and drink," she announced. When no answer came, she knocked again. "My lady?" A beat of silence came before a loud wail began to erupt inside the room. Worried about her mistress' well-being, she burst through the door to come to her aid. "Oh, my lady!" She fretted almost immediately. The tray in her hands dropped in her haste in spilling its contents on the floor. Crouched pathetically in a fetal position, still in her sleeping gown and hair loose and barefoot, laid her mistress, Lady Claudine, sobbing her heart out, a letter clutched tight against her breasts as though she was trying to merge with it. "Leave me alone," she demanded upon the sight of her maid. Her eyes turned into a sharp glare almost immediately but lost some of their intimidation at the tears that persisted to escape from them. Mary sharply halted in her steps, appearing to hesitate in obeying her mistress' wishes. She can't possibly let her mistress wallow in her sorrow alone. "But out! Get out, Mary!" she screamed, tears still pouring out of her. Mary wanted to protest. "But you, please," she begged, softly this time as she sobbed, "please just leave," she pleaded before she went back to curling on her room's floor, hugging the letter back to her chest. The protest left the maid's heart in a quick second at the sight of her broken-up mistress. She thought that Lady Claudine could remain graceful in her grief, but she too was just human. And when a loved one dies, no amount of grace can hide the pain one truly felt in their passing. Deciding to finally give her some space, Mary softly closed the door behind her to leave her mistress alone for now. Even as she closed the door behind her, Claudine's cries echoed ominously throughout the empty corridor as she cleaned up the dropped tray of food before leaving. Claudine, for her part, could barely remember why she ended up crying on the floor so pathetically. As soon as her mother had taken leave, she opened up the last letter and read it. She was just reading the letter. Yet after the sleepless night she had, and when the morning sun rose to a new day, she found herself weak, and unable to bring herself to even rise from where she laid catatonically. The only thing that convinced her was the sight of his unopened letter. She needed to read his last letter. And so with shaky hands and a broken heart, she opened the last letter she would ever get from him. "I love you, Claudine," a phrase he'd penned her multiple times, in every letter since the war happened. "I know how afraid you are, what you're afraid of. And I cannot promise you that it won't come true, because, in reality, I'm no miracle worker like Matthias. But I have to believe that whatever hardships may come our way, we will endure because of my love for you. I'll shoulder everything you're afraid to face, my love, because that's just how much I want to be with you. I plan to drown out all your problems with my love alone, if only you'll have me." He'd promised her a million times he'd return. Promised how his love for her would make him endure the war. And now he's dead, and she'd yet to give him her millions of confessions in return. The obituary in the newspaper brought by the Countess belonged to Marquis Lingman, not Duke Herhardt. News of Rietz was listed along with many others and arrived just as his last love letter did. There was another unexpected air raid, the paper had announced, and this time, they targeted the rear units, which were largely undermanned. The rear unit was caught so unprepared, housing most of the army's patients, that Riet had been counted along with the many casualties to be shot and killed in action. "He's not dead. He's not," she muttered absently under her breath, the letter clutched tightly in her palms. Another night came, and then another day rose. Still, Claudine found herself unable to part with the letter, still huddled pathetically on the floor, sobbing wildly in grief and mourning. How long has it been? A day? 2? Did it even matter anymore? She supposed it didn't. What was the point in trying to live such a miserable life anyway? Even he, who wrote her such enthusiastic love letters, ended up dying alone and far away from home. She wished to read a different man's death, and wished for Riet to return. And yet it had always been cruel to her, because her Riet was now dead, and she dreads to see the Duke's return home. Just when she was ready to say she loved him too, he was ripped away from her before he could even call himself hers. I love you. I love you. I love you. She repeated like a mantra, the light gone from her eyes, yet her tears far from stopping. There was so much she needed to say, so much to apologize to him for, and now she'd never be able to say it. Why him? Of all people. Why did he have to die? I love you. The more she reread the letter, the more the emptiness in her heart threatened to overwhelm her. The line of him declaring his love for her kept flashing back and forth in front of her. She had to let it go. But the moment she did, she found herself unable to breathe a moment more, her chest tightening so painfully. She reached out for it in a panic, that she fell from her chair. The threat of the sob began to escape from her. And as soon as her fingers brushed upon the edge of the paper, she gripped it tight and brought it down to her chest, and gave in to the overwhelming despair swallowing her whole. The only warmth in her stemmed from the flimsy paper in her grip. Just ink and paper were all she had left of him. Like his touch still lingered on the letter, she wanted to will him back to life, to be back with her. Close to touching, close to confessing. Memories of his fading voice and laughter only made her scramble around to keep him tightly anchored to her. Wound up so tightly, she felt something in her break. Ah, so this was how it was. This was how it was to be truly heartbroken. And when something is broken, nothing will ever be the same again. I love you, she repeated, her hopeless plea carried off by the silence, unable to reach its recipient. How cruel fate was to her, that the world should keep turning when hers had just ended before it had even begun. Middle. The memory that remained buried deep within his heart served as Matthias' motivation to survive, his sole raison d'etre. Like the beautiful golden wings of a butterfly fluttering in this solemn gray world, it illuminates this painful and arduous path of his to the place where he needs to return, back to that place where he truly belongs. He slowly opened his closed eyes, staggering for a bit as he tried to stand up. The afternoon sun seemed to be teasing his eyes with its bright, irritating ray of light. A fellow soldier, who had been by his side shooting at the enemy a while ago, was now covered in blood. Their unmoving body had collapsed on the cold, hard ground. The dark red blood flowing from the corpse's fragmented head and chest caused by the artillery shell wetted Matthias' military boots. If he was the one who stood in front of the window just now, he would have been the one who was now lying there as a shattered, cold corpse. Life and death would always be a second away from one another. Did Riet also feel the same way before his life trickled away like grains of sand in the wind? Did he expect that he would die before Matthias? For a moment, the dead comrade's face shifted into Riet's, before returning back to its real face. After exhaling deeply, Matthias picked up his gun lying on the floor and turned around. Another shell flew in with a rumbling sound which shook the stone walls around him, hinting its imminent collapse. He, however, persistently continued on his way, completely ignoring the danger surrounding him. Unlike the information he had received from the intelligence reports, the enemy commenced their attacks in broad daylight in an attempt to recapture the city occupied by Berg a few weeks ago. The city possessed a junction where 3 railroads intersect, making it a key point of supply, which meant that it was a place where multiple fierce battles were bound to take place. Schwip! With a shout that couldn't escape from his mouth, an enemy soldier completely fell down without even knowing how he died. Matthias stepped out behind a pillar located opposite to the now lifeless body of the enemy, who couldn't even utter a single scream before his life was extinguished. He proceeded to stand behind a nearby wall, The warm rays of the sun together with a gust of cold wind wrapped around his tired body. The wall on the other side was already half collapsed by the enemy's artillery fire, and the wall where he stood behind would face the same fate soon. When they had difficulties breaking through the enemy's defensive line, the army would resort to breaking down all the small-scaled walls to enter the opposite side's territory. Doing so reduces the enemy's defensive structures and lessens any potential threat of ambush. He was well aware of such tactics since it was one of the most common strategies that the Berg army would use when advancing on enemy's territories. However, Yandere participation changed many parts of the battlefield. Initially, the Confederate forces had been powerless since they didn't possess a mortar that could break down the castle's thick wall. But, thanks to the weapons provided by Yandere, they were now attacking vigorously with weapons that could even rival Berg's and implementing the same tactics that Berg used without hesitation. Retreat. 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 A desperate command to retreat was ordered to the troops, who were deployed to defend the wall, rang out accompanied by the unending sound of gunshots. He found it a little ridiculous that they finally issued such a command after half of their troops were already dead. If it had been ordered at least an hour ago, then perhaps more people would have listened and survived from this unexpected ordeal. Matthias, with a mirthless smirk on his lips, hurriedly moved towards his destination. If only he could, he would have run with all his might, but his injured body prevented him from doing so. Did I get hurt? He tried to remember, but he couldn't recall any instance where he could have sustained any injuries. His dizzy head was also still reeling from the recent explosion that their troops had just experienced, inhibiting his mind from thinking too deeply. In the end, their commander failed to properly grasp the enemy's firepower. Just a while ago, their side firmly believed that their enemy was not reckless enough to continue deploying their troops to attack the defensive wall. Thanks to this firm belief, they became the perfect candidates for betrayal, to turn one's allies into rats trapped in poison and dedicate them to the enemies. However, it was difficult to fully put the blame on the commander's shoulder since no one had expected the Confederation to be in possession of the same weapons as Berg's. Not until the Leyla army fired the first mortar. As his vision started to blur once more, the beautiful wings appeared in front of him again, fluttering mesmerizingly amidst the chaotic scene. Ever since the day he had left, Matthias had always seen the golden wings in his vicinity as if it was his guardian angel. Thanks to this, he still firmly believed that there was still a chance to successfully counterattack and turn this hopeless situation around despite their army's complete disastrous defeat. He was convinced that he was still alive thanks to his lovely little bird waiting for him back home. Leyla. With his lips smiling softly, Matthias uttered his beloved's name sweetly. Just saying her name filled his being with sweetness enough to drown his whole being. The time to blink his eyes was getting longer and his urgent movements changed slowly to a pace similar to a person enjoying a leisure walk. As soon as he became aware of his sluggish body, Matthias' tired body immediately fell flat on the sun-heated stone floor like a doll whose strings were suddenly cut off. He struggled to keep his drowsy eyes open and finally noticed the path where he came from. Dark red streaks flowed on the rubbled walls and destroyed paths which he had passed. It took him a few more blinks to realize that it was actually his blood. It was his blood, it was him that left those bloody traces. The blood flowing from his left shoulder, perhaps due to an embedded shell fragment, had now completely soaked half of his military uniform. Spilling this much blood would be deemed a serious injury, but his muddled brain couldn't even perceive any pain, much alone comprehend he'd lost so much blood until the critical moment. Fully comprehending his current situation, his throat let out a short and sudden voice. It was a giggle mixed with his ragged breath, ironically laughing at his current situation. He was fully aware how bad this turn of events was and its potential end result, his death. He leaned his battered body against the railing and gave his all to keep a hold of his slipping consciousness. The smell of rusted iron began to intermingle with his breath. His hand, which grabbed his hair like he was trying to tear his head off, gained more strength as he continued to inflict pain upon himself. Matthias leaned against the railing and tried to hold consciousness. The smell of rusty iron began to seep out of his breath. His hand, which he grabbed like he was tearing his head off, gained strength. "Wake up," he relentlessly commanded his muddled brain while pulling his hair harder. However, even after doing so, his eyelids only felt heavier with every passing second. The sound of the mortar, which should have been close to where he was, felt like a faint noise that came from a distant place. Wake up. He wanted to fall asleep for a second, to just take a quick rest. He would just let his body recover for a bit, then he could finally get up and continue once again. "Leyla. To you. I'll be back, I promised. So. Just for a bit." "Fucking wake up now." By the time his eyes were almost closed, Matthias caught a glimpse of the ribbon fluttering in front of him. It was the same ribbon that Leyla had put around his wrist, his talisman that protected him without fail since that day. When Layla's image of tying colored threads together while searching for various bird nests in the forests and rivers of Arvis came to his mind, his lips, which were shut in a flat line, let out a genuine and light-hearted laugh full of joy. She always enjoyed seeing the birds return back to their nests, and she would always become happy and be filled with overwhelming joy once she saw those birds. She was so unlike him, a lonely kid. He stared at the fluttering ribbon with blank eyes. He thought of her life full of loved ones who once left, but never ever returned back to her lonely self that was waiting earnestly. He now finally fully understood the reason why Leyla loved Arvis migratory birds so dearly. "Leyla." With his voice also gone, Matthias whispered his beloved's name with quivering lips. He promised her. He said he will definitely return. Leyla said she believes him and will wait for him. And he would give his all to fulfill his promise, no matter what cost. "I have to go back. I need to go back. I must." He stubbornly lifted his injured body, biting his lips hard to the point of bleeding. Even with his hazy consciousness, the sound of artillery fire penetrated his mind continuously. He began to walk once again towards the wall where dust clouds rose and broken bricks were rolling around. His legs were twisted together and his body stumbled repeatedly, but he never showed any signs of stopping on his path. Taking a few shaky steps after he just got up, he, in the end, collapsed once again. Matthias supported himself against the stone floor with his blood-soaked hands. A slight giggle erupted after taking a few rough breaths. When he opened his closed eyes that he hadn't realized were squeezed shut, his vision blurred by fatigue became a little bit clearer. Tears and sweat mixed together as it slid down towards his chin and dripped down to the back of his hand. "Just one more time. Get up. One more time." Whenever he blinked and tried to focus his dazed eyes, tears continuously flowed down from his eyes, flowing down towards his chin and dripping at the back of his wet hand. Each drop felt hotter than the last, stimulating his muddled brain bit by bit. He found his desperate situation funny, so Matthias repeatedly let out a dry laugh, his breath accompanied by a thicker smell of blood. "You have to live," he repeatedly whispered to himself quietly. "Leyla, for my Leyla, you have to live." He had to live because she was still waiting for him. It took him more time than before to finally be able to support his body, and in the end, he finally managed to get up once again. After rubbing down his wet face, he straightened his back and began to move forward, taking a step after step. His bloody eyes were now half closed from exhaustion, but Matthias never stopped walking. He had to go. Even if he would also become someone who had failed to return back to his lonely bird's life. Even if he would also become someone who had failed to return back to his lonely bird's life. He needed to keep his promise till the bitter end. He wanted to be forgiven. He wanted to return to the place where Leyla was, to stand beside her. To that place where they could start once again with their love for each other, where their love story would begin and unravel through thick and thin. Matthias moved quickly with renewed vigor when he finally caught a glimpse of the stairs below the wall. At the moment when his foot just stepped at the stairs, the mortar shrapnels, which battered the solid wall one after another, finally broke through the wall accompanied by a loud explosion. In the collapsing world, he caught a glimpse of the brilliant golden wings fluttering in the wind. "Leyla," he whispered with a smile. This was the last sight that was burned to his memory before everything went black. News of the battle in the city of Leyla was not delivered to Berg until a few days later. The newspaper, which featured a photo of Duke Herhardt donning an officer's uniform on the front page, began to spread rapidly throughout the streets a day before the new year. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 145, New Year's Eve. The morning paper, which had been delivered since early in the morning, lay untouched on the table even though lunch had already passed for quite some time. Like a buzzing bee, Leyla had been hovering around it from time to time in a nervous fret. Whenever she tried to reach out and open it, she would end up turning around and walking away in fright. This scene had occurred multiple times already since early in the morning. In an attempt to somewhat ease up her anxious mind, she would every now and then talk to her only companion, which was the unborn child in her womb. She couldn't help but to speak to them at every available moment she had, even as she warmed up a cup of milk to distract herself. She turned her head towards the windows, flipping open the curtain slightly before immediately drawing it shut once again. In the past few hours, she had been doing such random actions repeatedly, including tossing a few more pieces of firewood into the fireplace. Finally running out of chores that she could use as an excuse to distract herself from the crippling anxiety, she finally managed to return her attention back to the morning newspaper and opened it at long last. She apprehensively stared at the newspaper for a long time and finally made sure his picture was fortunately not included on the list of those that passed away in the war, which was what she noted immediately after checking repeatedly. A huge sigh of relief finally escaped from her soft lips. Her hands that were gripping the paper were now notably shaking less. Reading the list of names of those that had passed away once again, she closed her eyes and finally breathed in deeply. Ever since she read the news about Marquis Lindman's death, realization dawned on her that perhaps the next paper that would arrive might be bearing Matthias' name instead. As much as she didn't want to see this thought become reality, there was no other way for her to know but to regularly check for his name on the papers. "Hi, Miss Lewellin. Or should I call you Duchess now?" Riet turned to greet her dryly in a drawl, just before he had to leave and return to his unit. "When we meet once again, I guess your baby will have already been born. I'll go see you both once that happens. You're going to allow me, right?" "Of course." "Thank you." He thanked her, this time sounding genuine in her ears. "And I'm sorry," he added shortly after. "Sorry? For what, Marquis?" Leyla tilted her head in confusion, and Riet, on the other hand, only smiled sadly at her. At first glance, his smile, that was only lightly uplifted on one corner of the mouth, slightly resembled Matthias. "Just for this and that," he told her with a wink, pertaining to all the schemes with Claudine that he participated in, while also apologizing on behalf of his beloved. Leyla couldn't understand why he apologized for something that had long passed, but there was no time left for them to have a long conversation. "I hope that the baby will only look like the mother. Especially if it's a son." After taking a few steps away from her, Riet looked back and shouted, "Think of it as a wistful wish for my nephew." He jokingly shouted with a playful smile as he left. That was the last time she ever saw him, her last memory of the playful Marquis. And that would be how she would remember him forever, playfully smiling while bantering back and forth with her. Leyla removed her glasses and put them down at the end of the table, then rubbed her eyes wetted by tears so hard they began to hurt. Her hands that were tightly clenched were as cold as ice. The obituary, which she was only able to check after a long time, did not contain any familiar names that she knew. A sigh of relief flowed out from her once again, but her anxious heart still could hardly calm down. She didn't like feeling this way, so she decided to go outside for a walk. Leyla walked slowly through the residential area and towards the park at the end of the museum. When she reached the final term of her pregnancy, her ability to move was compromised by her bulging belly, and that made her take quite a long time to walk even at such a short distance. "Look at your mom. She's just like a penguin waddling around, right?" She burst into laughter when she saw herself reflected in a shop's show window. "Oh, You must not be able to see because you are still in my stomach. Don't worry, we'll see each other soon, right? By that time your mom wouldn't be a penguin then. Such a funny image occurred inside her mind and she smiled happily once again. After taking a short break, she continued walking carefully once again, waddling around like a penguin threading on ice. She noticed that there were more people like her walking around on the streets decorated with various festival ornaments, when typically, during this time of the year, the majority of the residents stayed inside at the comfort of their homes with their loved ones. Perhaps they were also like her, trying to distract themselves from the dreary and suffocating atmosphere that the war had brought to their homes. However, she could still see the affectionate faces of lovers and families out and about, showing their odd excitement and hopeful expressions on the upcoming year-end and New Year holidays. Not even the war clouds overhead could dampen their faith for a better tomorrow. "Shall we eat something delicious for dinner tonight?" she immediately inquired her baby, trying to shake off the desperation in her bones. "What would you like? Would you like what I like? Or perhaps something your father does?" Even if she patted her stomach repeatedly, the child inside her belly continued to be unresponsive. Feeling a little lonely, Leyla walked more vigorously while slightly kicking the floor. "Come to think of it, Mom doesn't know what Dad likes. I should have asked him at least once." Her sullen words were accompanied by a white mist from her breath as it scattered in the air. "I actually had a lot of questions for him. I will definitely ask him a lot when he finally gets home," she murmured with determination while walking a bit faster. However, among the people walking on the street, she was still the one with the slowest pace. Just as she turned around in the corner in front of the museum, some boys skidded past the streets with shouts of news. An extra, an extra." Almost everyone in the streets froze upon the announcement. At this point everyone knew that any news would only be more updates about the war, and any update most likely came bearing misfortune. Leyla began feeling a dreadful pit in her stomach, churning uncomfortably as the worst thoughts immediately began racing in her head. With her tense and worry-filled mind, she missed the fact that she had been handed a newspaper. It ended up falling to the snowy ground. She needed to pick it up, but even as her fingers twitched, her body refused to listen to her will. However, her eyes could still see the headline and the picture on the front page, which made her vision turn blurry as the strength on her feet slowly left her. Duke Matthias von Herhardt was killed in the battle to defend the southern front. She blinked her eyes at the horrible sight in front of her, hoping that her eyes were only playing a trick on her. But the awful news was still there, as if it was embedded deeply into her eyes, as if someone was poking a knife right through them. Deafening ringing persistently rang out in her ears as the world around her blurred out completely. "He promised. He made a promise to me," she repeatedly stated his vow inside her head. "He wouldn't break his word. He told me he will definitely come home. He can't be dead. He can't. He wasn't allowed to die just like this." "Miss, do you need help?" A middle-aged woman approached Leyla, who was standing still. She picked up the fallen newspaper and kindly placed it in Layla's hand, then continued back on her way again. However, the newspaper fell back to the ground once more, slipping out of her fingers again as she refused to believe that everything was real. Leyla, who finally couldn't hold back her grief, also fell down along with it. She gasped for air, trying to make sense of the news. She knew that he mustn't be dead, that it was not real. She tried to get back up, but she could only feel hopelessness and was unable to find the strength to get up from the freezing ground. She wanted to erase the memory of seeing the news, but she could only continue staring at it and nothing else. Shaky fingers stroked his picture on the newspaper, as if trying to summon him in front of her by just reaching out to his picture. "Oh my God. Hey, are you okay?" The middle-aged woman from a while ago shouted in astonishment after she worriedly turned around once again. The eyes of the passers-by followed her figure that was running towards Leyla. "Everyone, help me." All they could see was Leyla struggling to breathe as she clutched her stomach desperately. The woman tried to hoist her up to her feet, but Leyla was stubbornly unable to move. "We have to move her to the hospital. I think her baby is going to come out." Come on. Middle colon middle middle lies. I don't believe it, I don't. In Leyla von Herhardt's sharp scream shook the spectacular parlor that was unusually silent. The Herhardt family had gathered in a hurry after they heard the news of Matthias' death, and all of them were currently focused on the grieving lady. I understand how you feel, but please. My son didn't die. That can't be true. She shook her head vigorously in denial that her gracefully tied hair became messy. Hurry up and tell me. No, he can't do this to me. She hastily approached her mother-in-law and hopefully asked, trying to deceive herself that the news of her son's death was just a bad dream. My dear. Norma stared at her sobbing and pleading daughter-in-law as her eyes also slowly turned red due sadness. She had lost her husband, her son, and now, even her grandson. She had lived far too long and suffered so much for the same terrible reason over and over again. This was not the first time she received such news, but the deep sorrow that could break her heart to pieces that accompanied it was something she would never get used to. Let's accept it, Elise. Norma lifted the handkerchief in her hand and wiped away Elise's tears. We should do so for Matthias' honor. You know that, don't you? She resolutely declared, either to support a fellow mother that had lost her son, or as a message to her own self just to prevent herself from breaking down, or both. Unlike her cool-headed words, her voice was shaking with grief, her eyes holding back the tears. Elise stared resentfully at her mother-in-law, but soon sobbed with compassion, and eventually she collapsed due to shock. The news caused a grave disturbance in Arvis. Every servant and employee in Arvis ran about wildly and frantically upon the news of their master's death. Messages of condolences from various business partners and clients immediately flooded the estate. Hessen, who had taken the duty of dealing with him, could only absently take their well wishes as he sat numbly by his desk from dusk until dawn. Mr. Hessen, a call from the lawyer, Mr. Stov, has arrived. He's looking for you in a hurry. As the sorrow that he had been trying to suppress began to rise, a servant suddenly delivered an unexpected news. Stov, a lawyer in charge of Herhardt's internal affairs, was the person who helped Leyla settle in Rats in accordance with the will of the Duke. It wasn't difficult for him to guess why the secret conspirator would contact him at such a late hour. Hessen tucked in his sorrow deep down his heart and went to answer the phone. He couldn't break down now, so it was not the time for him to mourn yet. For now, he still had a job to do. Ms. Lewellin is currently in the hospital. It seems that her labor has started suddenly and it's already been a while. Hessen's eyes grew bigger with the sudden news. Isn't it too early? That's true. I think it was caused by the shock of hearing the news of the Duke's death. I also just received this news. I'm contacting you in advance before I leave to Rats. I see. Thank you, Mr. Stov. I'll do my part, too. Hessen put down the receiver with trembling hands. A child born on the day the news of his father's death was delivered to the whole empire. He gently closed his eyes in an attempt to hold back his tears. Should he reveal it? The Herhardt family would soon be embroiled in great confusion and quarrel over succession because of the sudden death of the Duke. If the soon-to-be-born child was a son, he would become the only successor of the Herhardt family. Thinking of the current circumstances, the child's existence was very important and should be revealed. However, the Duke had already given his orders regarding this matter. He ordered that he would respect Leyla Lewellin's choice, leaving everything for her to decide. In the end, even if he was no longer in the world, Matthias von Herhardt was undeniably still his master. Hessen stepped out into the dark hallway with her lips tightly closed. A child was born on New Year's Eve. As if proving his existence, he let out a loud cry on a deep night just before the bell rings, which marked the end of the year and the beginning of the new year. Middle middle middle. The nurse firmly held out the newborn child wrapped in a white cloth to the arms of the mother, who endured the pain of childbirth alone. Leyla's face was ashen, and she was still half-conscious by the time the nurse presented her child to her. Finally seeing their beloved child, her heart couldn't help but to feel torn with a bittersweet happiness and despair. The baby is healthy. The nurse smiled and told Leyla, before she gently handed the baby to the new mother, who cradled the child stiffly in her arms. "He's a little small, but there's nothing wrong with his health." "Really?" Leyla asked the nurse, anxiety clearly shown on her face. Her lips trembled with apprehension as she stared at her child. He was a child who had suffered a lot already, even since he was still inside her womb. Additionally, he was also born earlier than what was scheduled. "Of course. Here, look at him." The nurse stepped back after adjusting Leyla's posture so she could hug the child comfortably. It was only then that she carefully lowered her gaze and finally looked at the child in her arms. When she gently stroked his black hair, the child wiggled his small body as if silently protesting against his mother's actions. The deep dark color of his hair made his skin appear paler than what it is. Leyla, who had spaced out for a while, gave a light smile and proceeded to stroke her child's cheek. The soft texture made her wonder how it could be possible for his cheeks to be so soft as her eyes slowly got teary again. Suddenly, a faint sound of bell ringing enveloped the room, and the frowning child in her arms gently opened his eyes. It wasn't too long, but she clearly saw it. Blue. A pair of beautiful and clear blue eyes. More tears poured out of her eyes, wetting her cheeks and smiling lips. Accompanied by the sound of the bell announcing the new year, Leyla cried while laughing, either due to happiness or sadness, or maybe both, she didn't know. Their beautiful baby inherited his father's pretty blue eyes. "Our son, he's so pretty. Please come back. Come back home to us," she pleaded desperately as she cried. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 146. Summer again. Winter soon passed, then spring came and went like a breeze. Now the time for summer has arrived once more. The war had eventually come to an end with the Northern Union coming out as victorious. However, both sides suffered enormous casualties during the war. Whatever advantage both sides had gained from the war was nothing compared to the losses they had suffered in the end. The citizens could only comfort themselves by thinking that their friends and loved ones died fighting for what they believed was right. A single golden tower was erected as the symbol of victory that would mark the end of such a historic war. What is the use of such honor in the face of sorrow? A noble lady lamented as the procession of returning soldiers ensued. Many family members had come to greet their long-separated relatives, finally reuniting with them once again. Still, messages of condolences and fond stories were exchanged here and there for the families who had forever lost their loved ones. Amidst the many questions that were asked at the moment, the most prominent was who would succeed the Herhardt family. Any recent mention of the late Duke would often lead to the issue of his succession. The topic was both considered taboo and intriguing for everyone who had visited the Herhardt matriarchs to give their condolences. Without a successor left behind after the Duke's passing, his loyal followers had taken to vaguely answering any questions regarding succession, not willing to reveal any future plans. As much as they had wanted to proceed with choosing a fitting successor, the current figurehead of the family, Leyla von Herhardt, refused to choose until her son's body was returned and buried in their home estate. Until then, the seat of the Duke would remain vacant for the foreseeable future. They shouldn't delay deciding for the successor of the Duke for far too long. If he had only married Lady Brandt the year before last, then this tragedy wouldn't have happened. Marriage doesn't guarantee that Lady Claudine will have a son though. Alas, they are still a very prestigious family in the end. I guess that's true. Everyone either agreed or disagreed with various stories regarding the issue. Although I guess it's also a relief for the Brandts, if their lady had gotten married in a hurry before the Duke participated in the war, he would have made their daughter a widow. How's Claudine doing? I heard she's going to have a new engagement soon. Oh, already? There's no reason for her to delay when the engagement with her Herhardt family has been nullified anyway. Count Brandt must have been very diligent to be able to find a pretty good marriage so quickly. No matter how good the marriage candidate is, he couldn't be better than the Herhardt family's heir. I felt so sorry for Claudine and Count Brandt when I heard the news about the annulled engagement. Multiple individuals exchanged their opinions with a feeling of compassion and relief. Suddenly, enthusiastic cheers began to resonate from the other side of the street. Before long, Their lost husbands, sons, and lovers were finally able to march their way back home. Middle dot colon middle dot 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 middle dot colon middle dot. The park currently felt desolate and empty since the people of the whole city had gone to greet the returning army. Thanks to this, Leyla was able to enjoy a leisurely walk more than usual. The sound of light footsteps walking slowly with the sound of the wheel rolling of the stroller, and the sound of the wind shaking fresh leaves harmonized like music in her ears. As she left the street lined with trees, she raised the shade of the stroller that casted a shadow over her sleeping child. The child, who was born smaller than normal, now grew up well and healthy, and the days where she was filled with worry had long passed. He was such a blessed child because he didn't catch any illness even once and had a gentle personality. Leyla continued walking and deliberately chose the way around the boulevard. The sound of footsteps continued along the quiet road. She was not confident, nor up to the task of seeing the returning army. Still in deep denial that Matthias wasn't going to return to her side in the end, she became more unwilling to go greet the soldiers marching back home to Berg. "The weather is so nice today, right?" she whispered to his sleeping son for no reason. Her breath gently moved the child's soft hair. "Mom likes summer," she shared offhandedly, before looking down at her baby. "How about you?" "Well, I guess you still don't know autumn yet," she hummed thoughtfully, a rueful smile showing on her lips, before her smile began trembling due to sorrow. Not even the child in her arms could stop the deep loneliness festering inside her. She continued talking quietly to her child who was sleeping soundly, when suddenly, she finally realized that the residential area where their house was located was now in front of her after looking around. The house, which Matthias had decided for them to stay temporarily until he returned, had now become her and her child's home. The Herhardt family's lawyer and butler tried to fulfill everything that the Duke promised to become a reality, allowing Leyla and their child to live a stable life. The days she'd had since then had been peaceful, uneventful. In the end, these boring days will continue in the future, because he was not here anymore. He was never coming back. Realizing the depression trying to flow inside her heart once more, Leyla hurriedly walked as if running away from the feeling she had long hated. In the end, it didn't take a long time before the sadness disappeared once again like a bad dream, and she finally realized her shoelace had already been untied. With a small sigh, she leaned down and began to tie the loosened string. As soon as she was about to tie a knot, unexpected memories came inside her mind like a raging flood. A day she once spent together with Matthias in a strange city, where everything was so bizarre. His image kneeling in front of her as he tied her loose shoelace came to her mind as if it happened just now. His quiet blue eyes, the warmth of his long fingers, the texture of the shoes she wore, and the neat knot he tied that would shake along every step she took. As the memory became clearer in her mind, her eyes became blurry with tears once more. She didn't wipe the tears away, but let it fall freely from her eyes as he cried her sorrow out until nothing but numbness was left once more. After catching her breath, Leyla hurriedly finished tying up her shoelaces and stood up. Breathing in deeply, she gripped the handle of the stroller and began to walk again, feeling lighter and more determined than a while ago. Just as she arrived at the front of her house, the redness in her eyes now barely noticeable, she noticed a tall man donning a military uniform standing at the front of her door. Her breath hitched, and heart stuttered. The man slowly turned around, and although Leyla beamed at the sight of him, the excitement inside her died down a little upon the realization that it wasn't the person who she was waiting for. Still, she couldn't help but to smile once again upon seeing him return home. "Kyle," she greeted warmly, before the sleeping child fussed and opened his eyes upon the commotion. Middle dot colon middle dot 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 middle dot colon middle dot. Kyle stayed inside the sunny living room together with Layla's child as she diligently prepared tea in the kitchen. The baby did not cry in front of him, but despite Layla's assurances that he was a gentle child, Kyle felt a little skeptical. He would have believed her, if it wasn't for the way the baby was looking at him. Almost like in a distasteful manner, the child seemed uncomfortable at the mere sight of him. It was a bit jarring to Kyle too, to see such a familiar face in a younger human being, But he still smiled and cooed at the child to the best of his abilities. "What's his name?" Kyle asked Leyla with a smile, who had just arrived with the tea as he bounced the baby on his lap. "Felix." Leyla answered with a sullen smile. Kyle handed the baby back to her, as she hugged the child and sat opposite of him. The two exchanged some mundane conversations with each other, with a friend who they felt that they hadn't met in a long time. Wars, in some way, had its way of making time stretch longer than they actually were after all. Kyle smiled at the fact that he was able to face Leyla now in a comfortable manner. "It's a great relief to see you home safely," Leyla told him with a smile. "You too." Kyle, who quietly put down the teacup, also looked at her with a smile. "I'm so glad that you have recovered your health and that you gave birth to a healthy child. It means we kept our promise to each other." Leyla beamed at him widely. "I know." Kyle's voice dropped to a whisper as his eyes turned a little red due to the memory of last autumn that he remembered due to Leyla's words. Originally he received a vacation certificate and planned to visit her, but it was cancelled due to a sudden change in the permit. Leyla, who had not fully recovered and just gave birth, was going to be alone with her child. Kyle wanted to stay with her, but she assured him that she was going to be fine alone with a bright smile. That day, he promised he would return as he said his goodbye. He left and was assigned to a military hospital on the border. "Let's meet again in good health." The moment he held her hand, Kyle finally burst into tears that he couldn't hold back. She comforted him until he cried his tears dry. She told him he needed to hold his luggage tightly, to be brave. He knew her slender back was also shaking, but Kyle decided to pretend that he didn't notice. That was how the two of them bid farewell to each other. "Are the Duchesses of Herhardt aware about Felix's existence?" Kyle, who was looking at the child laughing in his mother's arms, asked worriedly. Leyla shook her head, determination in her eyes. "Are you going to be fine? Raising the child on your own?" "I'll wait until he comes back," she answered him resolutely. He was a little taken aback by her answer, before nervously wiping his hands on his lap. "Leyla," he promised. "He made a promise to me," she snapped almost immediately, cutting off anything he had to say. She then patted the child's head, before laughing suddenly. "He promised he'll be back. So, I will wait." "Leyla, that person," Kyle continued softly, before trailing off as he watched her eyes begin to be filled with tears. "I know. I know, Kyle." Her watery eyes glistened with tears, but Leyla did not lose her smile. "But I still want to wait. I thought he'd definitely come if I waited. I know it doesn't make sense, but I will still wait." "What should I do with this fool waiting for a man who has already died?" Kyle stared at Leyla with an indescribable look. He personally went to the place where Matthias was last seen. He braved the terrible battlefield himself when they realized the Duke hadn't returned, only to see the walls had all been turned to rubble and dust. It smelt like a day-old tomb as allies and enemies alike were strewn about just anywhere. Almost everyone was wiped out. Still, Kyle kept going because he was a medic. They needed to see if there were still survivors that they could save. Had he been anywhere other than the field hospital and was transporting critical patients during the raid, he would have become part of the casualties in the end. There was a lot that he wanted to say to Leyla, to make her understand, but he chose to keep his silence instead. They changed the subject and talked about typical everyday stories once again, but Kyle and Leyla knew that it could never be the same as before. When they realized that, they felt more comfortable with each other. With the war over, recovery from the trauma they had garnered during the war was their greatest concern. Leyla needed this time to recover most of all. He clapped his hands, and gave her a smile. "Well, I need to get going. My train's almost here," Kyle informed them before he stood up and gathered his things. "You're going back to Carlsbad, right?" "Yes. I'm going to stay with my parents until I return to school." "I see." "Take care, Leyla," he said with great wishes and concern, before winking at the baby. "Felix, take care too." Kyle smiled and greeted the two people who escorted him to the front door. This time, he reached out his hand first, just like what he did to a strange girl he met in the garden of Arvis, which was full of rose scent in the summer. It was really time to say goodbye. The day that changes one's life may come accidentally, just as it did many years ago with him. But when that same reason appeared once again in front of him, he hoped he could greet her comfortably despite past sorrows. He could now finally accept the fact that despite his heart still longing deeply for Leyla, parting from her was what's best for him to do. It was the best for both of them. Thanks, Kyle. Take care too. Just like on that fateful day, Leyla held his hand with a smile. The child, who was looking at the two people shaking their hands with a curious face, also burst into a clear smile. Without any remorse or grief, Kyle turned around and began to walk along the not-so-hot summer road as a cool wind blew past him. He didn't look back until he passed the corner of the street. Middle. A luxurious black car stopped in front of the military hospital in southern Lavada. An old gentleman with a tired face came down when the driver in uniform hurriedly opened the door of the back seat. "Thank you for coming." The waiting officers bowed their heads at the old man. It was none other than the king who asked him, someone whose lineage was from the royal family of Lavada and a prestigious nobleman, to such a remote place. He said there was a serious issue to be confirmed and it was a royal order, so he had to follow it. One of King Lavada's beloved nephews was seriously injured during the war and was being treated at a military hospital in Berg. When the royal family of Lavada asked for prompt repatriation, the Kingdom of Berg demanded that conditions must be offered. It was an absurd task entrusted to him to inspect said conditions. The reason was because he was the cousin of Katarina von Herhardt. "I've already confirmed his identity through our most verifiable means, but I must ask for your final confirmation." The officer who led him to the quiet ward politely explained. "This is it." Their footsteps stopped at the door of a certain hospital room at the end of the hallway. When he nodded, the officers who came with him knocked briefly at the door. As soon as the door opened, a young man, who was reclined in an upright seating position, was revealed. He was looking outside while smoking. White wisps of smoke billowed around the room. He slowly straightened himself up at the arrival of visitors. The daylight behind him made it difficult to identify him with the shadows in his face, but physically, he appeared healthy and in good condition. These days, one can never be too careful since the war had turned many good men into insane people upon the slightest of sounds. Despite the patient not looking like a sick person anymore, his arrival to the hospital wasn't easy. The officer who found him even had to drag his battered body to the hospital for treatment. The officer knew he was an enemy, a part of the Berg army that they'd just wiped out, but he was a medic first and foremost. He only saw a patient whose life he could still save. And so, they cared for him and nursed him, even as he remained unconscious for a long time due to severe blood loss and injury. Whether by miracle or sheer force of will which made him survive such a massive attack on their camp, the man kept breathing. And now here he was, awake and physically able to move and was able to smoke too. His status alone allowed him the privilege of staying in the hospital rather than being sent to their concentration camps for POW. The Herhardt family said they were ready to hold a funeral as soon as the war ended and the Duke's remains were recovered, but it seems they were fooled by a scammer. If not a scammer, which sane man would let himself be treated as a dead person, and for what reason? No matter how chaotic the war was, all military doctors who believed in a swindler's words and participated in such acts should be governed by strict military law. As anger began to soar inside the old man's chest, the young man threw his lit cigarette into an ashtray, then began to walk slowly towards the group of officers. As soon as he thought that the young man's straight posture and elegant steps were real, the old man suddenly stumbled and gasped for breath. The young man, who glanced at him after a while, looked very calm. The moment the old man bowed his head and greeted the young patient with a slight smile on his lips, the said young man burst into a ridiculous smile. It was the only answer that he could give. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 147, The Color of My Happiness. Matthias watched as the trees swayed against the wind outside, his gaze contemplative as he sat in the car and observed how much the world had changed, yet not Spring still came, and what had once been dry and brittle was now verdant with life. The border was the biggest surprise, however. Though he expected passage to be facilitated now, the car was allowed forward with barely a look and none of the previous, strict inspection procedures. Berg lay ahead, untouched by the war, an alien planet to eyes that had seen too much destruction and loss. As if nothing had happened, life continued on there, undisturbed. By the time the long-distance trip ended in Rats, his mind was already far away, rehashing recent events. Flashes of the collapsing wall that caught his fall as he lost consciousness were followed by his first, hazy moments as he woke up in a military hospital in Lavida. The terrible pain that greeted him allowed for an amazing realization. He was still alive. If I am alive, I will come back to Leyla, was his first, fully formed thought. Painkillers were generously administered by the frazzled, but efficient nurses. Nonetheless, his greatest comfort was knowing what the future now held. Happiness flowed such, after so long with so little of it, that Matthias would smile and laugh through the pain, uncaring if that made him seem a bit mad. When he finally fell into a restless, medically induced sleep, he dreamed of Leyla. It's such a beautiful dream. The pain gradually eased, but Matthias remained in bed for quite a while, his recovery slow. By the time that he was able to move freely, the flowers that he stared at through the tiny window near his cot were in full bloom. Spring had arrived to grace the world with sun and color again. He knew war made simple things complicated, so it was likely that his news never arrived at Berg. Any new communication, as well, could just as easily fall prey to the conflict, lost forever. With no way to inform his survival, he chose to stand by and plan. For the next 2 seasons, Matthias didn't exist in this world. What made the wait bearable was thinking of it as a time in which he was laying the foundation for getting Leyla close to him again, and the both of them to a place without a single shade. Of course, it was still hard. Leyla and her family were probably heartbroken by thinking he was dead, and that knowledge ate at him as he laid alone in bed late at night. But as with everything surrounding Leyla, Matthias couldn't regret his choices, not when he knew, hoped, they would allow him to make his way back to her. It's still like that, now. It will forever be. We'll be there soon, sir, the driver informed him, voice calm, as they entered the boulevard in front of the museum. Matthias was overwhelmed. He kept his expression shuttered, but the redness on his eyes gave his emotion away. Uncharacteristically, he fidgeted with his clothes, straightening his posture as he rubbed creases away. His eyes caught the residential area by the end of the street and he knew it wouldn't be long now. But not yet. He had a few things left to finish first. Nothing that would take a long time. The picture of grandiosity, Herhardt's mansion and Rats appeared as the car approached. The driver slowed down as they entered the path through the meticulously cared garden, and Matthias' lips tilted into a pale smile. Middle. Leyla von Herhardt couldn't let go of the doubt until the end. She knew it was unlikely to be a mistake, but she was too afraid to believe it. After having accepted her son's death, she spent a long time waiting for his remains to arrive so she could hold the dignified, emotional service he deserved. But now, everything has changed. Matthias will come back alive, she said out loud, as if the words would sink into her brain if she sounded them out. They did not. Still, if the news turned out to be false, she wouldn't be able to stand it. There was a reason why this matter was kept strictly confidential from the outside, as well, and Elise wouldn't discard this being some kind of mistake. She needed Matthias, in the flesh, to truly believe it. Check him over with her own 2 eyes. Only then. The car just arrived, Hessen reported, hurriedly entering the drawing room. The 2 duchesses looked at each other with a mixture of anxiety and nervousness, overwhelmed by the expectation of what came next. They heard the large, front doors open heavily, followed by the staccato sound of footsteps. Elise stared at the door of the drawing room, holding her breath, eyes already filling with hot tears. And Norma was no different. The women could swear they were able to recognize the steps, and they couldn't belong to anyone else. They didn't have to wait long for their miracle. The door opened slowly, revealing the unharmed, very much alive face of Matthias. He cautiously approached the women, who stood there, in shock, for a few moments. Elise, however, soon broke down into tears, overcome with emotion. The sun shone bright on the expensive carpet, invading the room through half-open curtains, illuminating this miraculous moment with a glow that seemed nothing short of divine. Without being prompted to, Matthias strode towards his crying mother and enveloped her in a hug, soon followed by his teary-eyed grandmother. "I'm back, Mother, Grandma. I'm back, now," he said. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. Leyla quickly finished preparing for the picnic by packing blankets and lunch boxes. She wore a straw hat with a wide brim and a ribbon tied snugly under her chin. The leather bag she wore across her shoulder was full of a delicious, fresh assortment of fruits and pastries. Her braided hair hung behind her back, a simple, but neat hairstyle. Her little boy was cradled on one arm as she left the house, a healthy, pink-cheeked baby. As if to make up for the time he was stuck inside his mother and had his growth limited by her body, the baby grew as fast as we'd left unchecked. He looked bigger than other children his age, and she was already sure he would grow to be as tall as his father. As much as he was already getting too heavy to carry for long, Leyla couldn't help but be gladdened by the thought. She wanted her boy to be strong. It was a typical summer day in Berg, with very bright sunlight softened by the cool wind. Leyla walked toward the park, skillfully pushing a baby stroller. The child was excited and babbling, perhaps in a particularly active mood today. Was he like this when he was a baby? She thought to herself. Truthfully, Leyla couldn't imagine Matthias von Herhardt as a gentle and bright kid, like her son is, no matter how young he was. Perhaps, somehow, he had been an elegant baby at Felix's age. She laughed at the silly thought, approaching the crowded park. Weekends were always busier around here. Many people enjoyed the free time to go out and see the nature. Leyla smiled at her chubby little boy, and Felix smiled back adorably. That was enough. Fixing the bag, Leyla turned the stroller to the direction of a quiet and pretty clearing, where she would have a little privacy to be with her son. On the road, by the front of the park's center fountain, she bought bright, colorful balloons from a stand. Felix's blue eyes grew round when she tied the balloons to the stroller and she smiled at his reaction. For Leyla, blue was no longer the color of sadness. Now, it was the color of happiness, the color of her greatest love in this world. From the first moment her child opened his eyes and greeted the world, that was it for her. But no. She remembered a quiet morning, a face so very close to hers as she laid side by side with him, looking deeply into his eyes, the quiet hanging undisturbed. Maybe blue became a happy color for her a long time ago. In a moment she couldn't help but remember. Wow, the balloon is so pretty, don't you think? Leyla grinned as she looked upon her child, who was staring at the balloon, transfixes. Her soft, lilting voice caught his attention, and he smiled with excitement. The balloon shook against the wind as they entered a quiet, peaceful stretch of woods in the park. The soft, nature sounds mixed with the laughter of mother and child, flowing together easily. Middle colon middle middle colon middle. As much as had happened, her heart's masterpiece miraculously returned to life was no different from before. Without hesitation, Matthias von Herhardt said something he should never say. Leyla is here. His tone was so calm that Elise von Herhardt doubted her ears for a moment. Earlier, Matthias spoke calmly of his injuries, treatment, and repatriation. He apologized for causing great concern and damage and failing to fulfill his proper responsibilities, though his tone would indicate that what happened was not remarkable in any way. Even after he had returned from the threshold of death, Matthias still managed to keep surprising her. On one hand, that was a relief. But what does he mean, Leyla? She thought, confused. Unpredictable, as life was, his words were too. Elise's mother-in-law arrived then. The two women shared uncomfortable glances, minds confused with unlike thoughts, filled with uncertainty. Matthias glanced at them and continued to speak in a low-pitched voice. "I have a child, too," he proclaimed. If their minds were confused before, they lost all reasoning now. They were shocked, their faces full of disbelief, looking at the brooding man as simultaneously they let out a gasp. "Oh my God! Matthias?" Elise, voice laced with surprise, hardly supported her wimpy body on the sofa's armrest. She sat upright, head raised. Her gut feeling was right, she guessed right. She knew he was too invested. Even if she had guessed the relationship between the two ages ago, Elise comprehended that the existence of the child was an unexpected truth. Matthias, eyes holding decisiveness, just looked at the old lady that barely blinked at the words he had uttered without consideration, just like he had done again. "Don't worry, we'll go about it the proper way. I will marry her." Another declaration from him. Another surprise for the women who glanced at him with astonishment. "Matthias, do you even know the weight of your words?" Elise wailed her son's name, as if mourning what he could have been. "Tell me." "Huh? Nothing." Matthias didn't consider answering. Human nature is rebellious. Once you get its taste, you crave it more until it leads to chaos. With a deep sigh, Norman ultimately leaned her back against the chair, body tired and mind blanked. "The illegitimate child. All right. I know it's not a light thing. But Matthias, there are many other ways to deal with this kind of problem," Elise assured. "Elise is right, Matthias. If you think so because of the breakdown of the mixture with Brandt, feel free to go back to other great infanting children." The old lady, who was continuing her words with her head in her hands, frowned as she trailed off. She tried to give it a thought but felt contrary to her own opinions. No matter how much she pondered, she understood what was peculiar. Matthias, the man who could have reached out to love at his relatives as much as he wanted, while let go of their hands and stayed in the hospital of his enemy's country. What else did Matthias gain in reciprocation for watching the news of the Duke of Herhardt's death spread to Berg? Perhaps thinking the same way, Elise von Herhardt turned to her with an awestruck face. "I know it's hard for you two to accept." Even in the face of suspicion and reprimand from the two old ladies, Matthias remained silent. Just like when they were finding out about his relationship with Leyla, the woman for whom he was ready to give up everything. Perhaps, he knew the significance of silence and the answers it gave. He understood human nature, loud and rebellious, contrary to tranquility, or maybe he was just waiting for the right time to utter words. "But the world is changing. I think a lot of things will change, perhaps quicker than they have in the past." "Matthias, actually, it doesn't matter even if it doesn't change." In Matthias' attitude, it was difficult to find any willingness to persuade his opponent. As if to say that it is nothing more than a notification of the decision he had already made. His steady gaze, carrying determination, looked at Elise. He waited for a few seconds, parting his lips as he talked. "If it's so hard to accept, I won't stain the Herhardt name with my stubbornness. Perhaps that will ease your worries a little." "What does that mean?" Elise von Herhardt, who was barely able to speak, asked sharply. Her hold on the armrest tightened. Perhaps she knew what was coming next, or maybe she just wanted to hear the words from her son. "I won't live as a von Herhardt." "Matthias," she snapped. "I will leave the name of the Duke of Matthias von Herhardt as it is now, as it belongs to an honorable nobleman who has oxidized for the empire. I am not that man anymore," he continued undeterred. Oh my God! The joy of seeing his son, who returned with nothing different, disappeared without a trace. It's none of your business how the world is changing, but the fact that the war completely changed her son seemed certain. He seemed foreign, like she was not seeing her son but a menacing man. And the fact that Matthias is not threatening to hit her son, who decided to become a perfect successor and lived a life perfectly, seemed to have decided to become something else now. Something she never thought of, even imagined it. So she knew that he would definitely make it out of it at all costs. It reflected through his eyes. The son, who they thought was dead, came back alive. Happiness that came like a divine feeling had vanished into the quietness. And now, There were two options. Either you lose the son or accept his decision. This is my decision. It won't change. Matthias looked at the two with a determined look that cemented the sincerity of his words. Herhardt's two duchesses glanced at each other, confused as to whom would initiate the step toward the child who had professed his choice. Now, you two decide. With a face that still had no agitation, Matthias politely declared. I'll follow that choice. Cry, even better if you beg. Chapter 148, E&D. The color of my happiness. The park in downtown Retz was large enough to contain lakes and forests, giving a peaceful scene for the city's residents and visitors. A place that could become someone's healing and personal one, away from the world's gaze. The western part of the park, with the most beautifully blended lake and forest, was Leyla's favorite. The vista from there resembled Arvis at first glance. It sparked a flood of memories, one might say full of pain, but it remained the most beautiful and missed place on earth despite all the pain and suffering it had given her. That place was still a part of her, a piece that she would never forget. Leyla unfolded a blanket, spreading it under the shade of the tree, and took out the packed baby's lunchbox. The first picnic she went on with Felix, it was just the two of them, yet it was brimmed with care and tenderness. She didn't mind that this moment might not be in his memories, as he was still young, but she was assured that he would always carry the fond memories of his childhood with him, and this moment would be one he treasured for the rest of his life. Leyla had a lot of things she wanted to give her child, the things that include happy moments with his mom, kind words, gentle touches, and a smile. The things she had wanted from her mother but never received them. She wanted to let her child know that there is someone in the world who will love him no matter what. Someone who would be there for him against all odds. Just like Uncle Bill did for her. She would do everything for her baby. Leyla would take on 2 jobs till he returned, eat well, laugh a lot, and cheer up. She would never make him a child who was half-loved without a father. Never. Leyla opened Felix's lunchbox before digging into her own. She watched him, happy and content, as he played cheerfully after his meal. His being focused helped her as she could eat peacefully without a need to rush. The child crawled over to her when she took a mouthful of fresh peach she had bought for dessert, sweet and delicious. He tilted his head, gazing at his mother through big blue eyes, every time she bit into and chewed on the peach. Leyla looked at him, blue eyes staring back, in a daze. She saw the face of the familiar man staring back. The memory of the man superimposed on the child's face grew uncontrollably large and clear. All she could see was him. The same blue eyes that once looked at her with hope. I'll be back. For sure. He made a promise, the promise she was waiting to be fulfilled. I love you. A confession to which she had not answered. She didn't know why, but as she stared at the blue eyes, her lips parted, as she uttered the same words the man had once. I love you. Leyla lifted her glasses and discarded them on the blanket, before turning to the child and whispered, I love you so much. The moment she confessed, she felt unfamiliar, like something had changed. Perhaps, because she could utter those with sincerity, and meant every word. The child giggled, maybe he loved hearing his mom's confession. A smile formed on her lips, eyes brimmed with tears, as she cradled her son in her arms warmly and protectively. The baby's sweet smell touched the tip of her nose as the child provided her mother happiness with his blissful giggles. And Leyla hugged him tighter, even feeling content with her son in her arms. Middle. 2 feet stopped at the entrance of an apartment. The man stared at the door. He lifted his hand, bringing it closer to the door, to knock. Hey, are you just passing by the neighbor's house? The woman gave the man with an oddly suspicious gaze. He stopped, disturbed by a voice, as he turned his head in her direction. Did you come to see the baby's mother who lives in this house? Her question, voiced with a look of relief, was tinged with wary interest. The man, with cautious, turned his attention to her. Yes. He answered short. The blonde little baby mother in the glasses. Is that right? Another question, she asked. Yes. Oh, you must be a baby daddy who went to war. Right? She who was looking at the man's face carefully, shouted with delight. He must be the baby daddy. Oh my, the woman thought, her brows raised. Without waiting for a response, she scrutinized him and immediately began to fuss. What should I do? Her husband came back from the battlefield and she went out. Is her house empty? He asked, voice deep and serious, glancing at the door. She went out with her baby earlier. I heard they'll go on a picnic in the park. She clapped her tongue with regret. Even at that moment, her gaze wandered over the man's face, who lifted his brows, gazing back at the woman. So Leyla was true when she said that her son looks nothing like her. But his face looked familiar. Where the hell did I see that guy before? She thought. Well, the baby's mom often goes to the park. It usually comes back around sunset. Why do you wait at my house until then? Because we'll be in trouble if the roads cross. No, thank you. The man declined the offer, looking in the direction of the park for a while. He came down the stairs and stopped in front of her. Thank you, ma'am. The man nodded and passed past her without so much as a backward glance. A black car was waiting at the curb, and as he got closer, an occupant hurriedly opened the back door. He was clearly no average Joe. She spent a long time staring after the car as it drove away, unable to escape her unsatisfied curiosity. It's definitely my first time seeing him. The afternoon breeze carrying her murmur ran up the quiet weekend afternoon road. Middle. The child, who had a good day of eating and playing, drifted off to sleep with an angelic face beside his mother. Leyla watched her son, lying face to face as he dozed off. She lifted her hand and caressed his head. The child's hair was in mess and she could clearly see the fingerprints stamped on the glasses, through her blurred vision. Leyla cautiously approached the end of the blanket. She began fixing her glasses and wiping them off, then loosened her messy hair. It seemed that the child had the same fondness for her hair as his dad had. It wasn't simply his appearance that resembled that of his father, he seemed to have adopted many of his father's quirks. Of course, his kid is more aggressive in his approach. He probably found something intriguing about her dazzling blonde hair. So when Leyla held him in her arms, he grabbed her hair and pulled it. He was happy and smiling cutely, but she felt sorry for loose strands of hair that had been tugged without mercy in his chubby hands. There was a time when she hated if someone would, by mistake, pull her hair. She never thought a time would come she would be happy with her hair pulled out. With a smile on her face, Leyla began to gently untangle her messy hair using her fingers as a comb. It was useless to tie or braid, so she thought she would rather cut it short, but he didn't like it. The fine blonde hair flowed down her shoulders and back, gracing her beauty, wrapped in the collar of a white dress. For a second, Leyla stopped paying attention to the braid in her hair and instead stared blankly at the late afternoon sun filtering down through the verdant leaves. The calm water of the lake was also colored brilliant gold as the soft waves played with light. Pretty. A modicum of awe flowed out of her lips at how the world looked, serene and lovely, like something out of a painting, as if those hellish days when shells rained down from the sky and shots rang out, were nothing more than fleeting dreams. Leyla sat in silence with her curled knees to her chest, her eyes drifting over the lake and the birds gliding lazily over it. Wild rose bushes wafted their pleasant scent on the breeze as it blew across the park. The rustling of the thick leaves in the wind seemed eerily reminiscent of a bicycle chain. It was a perfectly beautiful summer day, yet for some reason it felt so weird. Unfamiliar. Memories of the blue-eyed man stuffed her heart. How could he do this to me? He's not here. He's not coming back. Her eyes narrowed, staring at nature when the child's cry roused her. She looked at Felix, who had just woken up, was looking into the air and crying. She soon realized why her child was so upset. The balloon, which had been tied to the stroller's handle, flew away in the wind and hung between the branches of the tree. The rope seemed to have come loose. It's okay, Felix, Leyla soothed the child in a powerful voice, caressing his chubby cheeks. Don't cry. Everything's okay. Perhaps surprised by his mother's courage, the toddler stopped weeping. After wiping her son's tear-streaked face, Leyla sprang to her feet and ran over to the tree where the balloon was hooked. "Wait a minute. I'll get it for you." True to her word, she'd do anything for her child's happiness. Middle dot colon middle dot 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 middle dot colon middle dot. Finding Leyla was easy. He felt strange as he couldn't believe he had found her in this big park, with one vague clue that she was somewhere. But he did. He found her, sitting on a blanket under the shade of a tree, as she watched the scenery of the forest and the lake calmly. A place where it was difficult to be crowded because it was too remote. Even she played up her bravery. He knew his beautiful bird was actually quite timid. Matthias then recognized the existence of another person, his child. While he was still watching his son, Leyla began to go somewhere with a strong step. Left alone, the child tilted his head and looked at his mother's back. Matthias took another step towards him. By the time he reached the side of the blanket, Leyla had already made it to a tree standing a short distance from it. Just when he was beginning to wonder she was going to do, Leyla started climbing the tree. Matthias noticed a balloon dangling from a low-hanging limb, and finally realized what she was trying to do. He picked a low laugh, and the child sitting quietly in the blanket raised his head. Matthias followed the child's gaze and turned to look at him. The child arched his brow and gently blinking his eyes. Matthias looked at his son, before turning his attention to Leyla, who was seated on a branch and preparing to catch the balloon. And he began to take an unhesitating step toward her. Middle dot colon middle dot 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 middle dot colon middle dot. Though it was difficult for Leyla to reach the balloon, she was able to just barely grasp the string through the tree's thin, blooming branches. She smiled to herself at the accomplishment as she descended, landing on the ground safely. "Felix. Look at this." "Mom." Leyla, who had turned her head at the sudden noise, was frozen. She could not form coherent thoughts, let alone speak the moment her gaze met blue eyes. A man stood not too far from the tree. He was looking at her as he stood alert, with his back straight, and an arm behind his back. Their eyes met and he tilted his head, almost as if an invitation. The rather crooked and playful gesture was in stark contrast to his elegant appearance. Leyla gasped. She had suspected, but now she was sure. It was him. He has returned. Her heart thundered in her ribcage, fighting to jump into his arms. Her head, though, remained blissfully blank as she stared at him. It was ridiculous how her mind was in denial, and yet her heart had reacted to his presence. It was him, in the flesh. There was no doubt. It couldn't be anyone but him. He was here. Leyla stared at him, still clutching a balloon. She had placed a hand on the tree for support, and it continued to tremble like a leaf as she stood in a trance. The beady blue eyes crinkled near the corners as they continued to gaze at Leyla, indicating a smile. Wordlessly, he slightly raised the hand that had been behind his back. There were ribbons tied in the sleeves of the jacket and shirt, and they fluttered in the soft evening wind. It was very scenic, but still, strange. She had dreamt of this moment every single day without fail, conjuring up fantasies of the second their eyes would meet again. She had had enough time to play out each scenario over and over, how she would welcome him, wrap him up in her affection till it got hard to breathe for both of them. She had it all planned out, so why were her feet frozen? Why was her mind empty now, when she had thought of nothing else for so long? Perhaps there was no answer, not that she wanted, or he needed one. Leyla bit her lips, trying to control the tears that brimmed in her eyes, and just used all her strength to stare at him. Matthias's signature grin graced his face as he slowly opened his arms, unsure if that was the right move. She couldn't comprehend whatever happened next, and even her memories of the next few minutes were blurry, the details dim. All she remembered was her feet treading on the ground, tears streaking down her cheeks, and running towards him. Her vision may have been a blur, but her heart could see and feel with perfect clarity. Her golden hair was flowing as she ran towards him, faster and faster, like he would disappear if she even paused to breathe. Her heart continued to thump, erratic and unstoppable. She might as well have been choking on the words she had prepared for him, yet they refused to make their way to her lips. The moment she finally landed in his arms, a soft cry escaped her, not unlike the sound of a child that finally finds its beloved object after searching for so long. All her speeches and declamations went down the drain. Just one word was enough. Her one truth, Matthias. Leyla, he murmured, tightening his arms around her, pulling her closer as if they could melt into one. A balloon, that she had missed, rose high with the wind, its string mimicking the ribbon tied on Matthias's wrist. The child looked at the pretty balloon floating around, with eyes that resembled his father's. He watched the balloon float away, pouting and grimacing as if his tears had the power to bring it back. His mother certainly did. The balloon flew higher into the sunset sky and eventually disappeared from view. The child's eyes, sparkling with curiosity, turned to his mother and father, who were still wrapped in embrace, even as his mother continued to weep. The child kept turning his head from side to side, seemingly in pain, as if he couldn't decide whether or not to cry like his mom. Eventually he burst a broad smile. The lake was calm and clear as the birds slowly circled above the still water. The sky above them was a vibrant palette of reds, oranges. The bird is back. It was a long and pleasant summer evening with little to do, and they for sure would make the most of it.